Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Let Us Head Fanfics, back with amazing fanfiction. This is What If Deku Was Deaf and Genius. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. When Yamada found them, the man almost broke down the door to the room they had been given, storming in and over to them without a word before snagging Izuku out of the chair he was in and dragging him and Hitoshi onto a hug. I was so scared for you too, he sobbed before biting his lip. Obviously a way to remember to control his quirk. That made Izuku feel awful, the repercussions of what he did and running off hitting him all at once. He felt tears fill his eyes at the realization that he had scared his foster parents, and probably Mia and Mei as well, all because he was too stubborn to stop and think for a moment. I'm sorry, he whimpered where his face was pressed against the man's chest. I couldn't stand back. They took Toshi and I couldn't there he broke into sobs. The stress he had been under rushing in and taking over now that one of his heroes was there to protect him. He felt it as Hitoshi also started crying, shaking where he was pressed up against him and instantly felt ever worse. Who was he to cry when he had brought his situation on himself? Hitoshi had been kidnapped. He deserved Yamada's attention tight now, not Izuku. The greenette started to pull away, to give the two of them some space, but Yamada wouldn't loosen his hold, and after a second Shinso snagged a hand in his hospital-issued top. The small teen got the message and continued to let himself be cuddled, trying to push down the feelings of regret and inferiority. By the time Aizawa reached the hospital, it was well after midnight. He had been stuck at the scene helping the other heroes with the aftermath of the altercation for several hours, all while he ached to go and find his family. Eventually, the last confirmed perpetrator was hunted down and the heroes were released as the police took over. He took off over the rooftops as soon as he was free of the warehouse district, racing towards the hospital where Yamada had told him they all ended up, heading straight for their room when he got there, ignoring the concerned nurses who fluttered along behind him trying to check him for injuries. He opened the door to the room number he had been texted and almost slumped in relief at the sight that greeted him on the other side, as Ashi held up a finger to his lips to keep him from saying anything to wake the two boys who were sprawled across his lap and leaned against his chest. Aizawa could guess how Hisashi had ended up on the bed under their boys. Honestly, it looked far too tempting for himself as well, but he wouldn't risk waking the two exhausted teens if he didn't need to. Instead, he allowed an older and more persistent nurse to lead him over to a chair, ignoring her grumbled complaints about heroes who don't listen. She made him strip so they could check him over, thankfully not demanding he go back to the intake area to fill out his paperwork. He had a few burns from when the girl with the transformation quirk and the guy with the blue fire teamed up on him, and a couple of scrapes and scratches from falls and tumbling through the rubble. But overall he was well enough off, and according to his husband so were their kids. Izuku only had a few cuts from when Aizawa had almost been too slow in saving him. Hitoshi was dehydrated. There were some reopened scars on the bottom of his jaw from the muzzle. His shoulder had been reset and would need a sling for a few days. And there were sores around his wrists from the cuffs. But he was alive and there would be no lingering physical damage. The biggest issue they were seeing was the fact that he hadn't spoken a word. And knowing his history with quirk discrimination and muzzles, they could guess why. But that would be an issue to address tomorrow. For now they were all together and safe. For now they could heal. Shouter relaxed back into the chair after changing into the clothes the nurse had shoved into his arms, finally taking a real breath. For the first time since he saw Hitoshi's pale fingers disappear through a warp gate, he pulled out his phone, updating Mia on the situation, immediately receiving the reply that she and her daughter would be by to visit as early as they could come morning. Trying to brace himself for the two loud women, he settled down for a light cat nap. He would need a lot of energy in the coming days after all. Mei's entrance was just as dramatic as Hisashi's had been, waking up the four people in the room with a slam of the door as she stalked in. Izuku fell from his spot on the edge of the bed with a thump, writhing in his panic to get untangled from the blanket that had been laid over him in the night. He hadn't quite managed it before he was tackled back against the floor. Midoriya, Izuku, you motherfucking asshole. His pink friend screeched with a heady mix of fury and terror. How fucking dare you run off without me, you jerk. Before he could answer, she was scrambling up from on top of him and dashing around the bed to pull her other brother into a far more gentle embrace. God's Hito, you scared the shit out of me. I'm so glad to see you. The violet-haired teen leaned into his friend, quietly accepting the comfort, as Izuku was lifted from the tiles to be smothered by Mia. The woman fussed over his bandages and puffy eyes before giving him a soul-reinforcing hug of her own. He practically melted into the woman, letting her reassure herself that he was okay. Everyone shifted around the room for the next hour or so, passing the three children around in the name of comforting each other. Aizawa even played the part of Mei's chair at one point while the girl ran a check over his goggles and capture weapon after his very public fight the night before. How the teen had gotten a hold of his equipment specs he didn't want to know. Their moment of peace was unfortunately broken far too soon by the arrival of a familiar detective. He was polite as he asked if Shinso was ready to make his statement, but none of them were happy when the question made the already withdrawn teen retreat further into himself, hunching in over his lap before shakily signing a request to not speak aloud. Tsukachi agreed easily, though he did specify he would have to video record them to do a sign language interview. He quickly set up a tiny portable camera that he apparently carried around in his briefcase, getting everything ready before asking the Hatsumes to leave the room. He also asked if Izuku could leave as well, but Shinso didn't react to that request very well, so the matter wasn't pushed. In exchange, the man offered to do Izuku's own interview about the summer camp and the night in the warehouse district at the same time, so he had a reason to be in the room. Everyone quickly situated themselves, Izuku sitting on the edge of the bed by Hitoshi while the three men all sat beyond the camera's view. They booted up the tech and Tsukachi rattled off the usual opening of reasons for being there and a list of people in the room. And then they got into the rough stuff. Izuku decided to go first since he had a feeling Hitoshi still wasn't ready. He started his story with realizing something was wrong mid-hike, and how he and Jiru had helped ragdoll with the crazy guy who was trying to drag her off somewhere. He then went through the dash through the woods and separating their little group to send a rescue party out for a tiny boy who was most likely not at the camp. He described the scene on the ledge of the cliff and the fight with Muscular. He had to pause as he described gouging out the villain's eyes, overcome with a wave of nausea. Thankfully, the men were willing to be patient and waited for him to be ready before he moved on. The rest of the story went quickly, the teen glossing over carrying Kota down to camp and then his time at the hospital, only briefly mentioning overhearing a conversation about the League being in Kamino, leaving out who he eavesdropped on and the fact that he used his hearing aids to do so. He ran through sneaking out, making sure to mention lying to Todoroki so the other boy wouldn't get into trouble, and jumping on a train, before he got to the stress of wandering the nighttime streets of a rundown district, praying to hear or see something to lead him to his friend, eventually getting lucky enough to be close when the fighting went down. He finishes up his part with a quick overview of stepping in to keep Hitoshi from being dragged into the depths, of a flashing knife and being saved, and of dragging their asses to an ambulance. From there it's Hitoshi's turn, shaking hands, rising to sign for the camera as Yamada quietly translated for Tsukachi. The other teen has a similar recounting of a run through trees, a fight with a villain, this time the blonde girl who apparently has some sort of blood fetish. But then things shift when a hand latched around the back of his neck and suddenly he was in a too small space with a too cloudy head. He then skipped to when he was released an unknown amount of time later, telling of nausea and disorientation, of trying to fight when completely unbalanced, of cuffs and muzzles and snide taunts. He shivered as he recounted them, trying to convince him to flip sides, only letting him answer by shaking or nodding his head, wanting him to join them but too scared of his quirk to risk letting it loose. Then he went over the last few hours before rescue, of Toga baying for his blood and twice his manic routine, of watching the press conference, of All Might knocking a wall down and narrowly missing pummeling the kid he had come to save with the falling brickwork. And then he described a choking pressure in his lungs and the feeling of coughing up disgusting gray sludge, only to realize we was no longer in a bar but instead standing in the center of a battlefield, staring down a monster with no hope of outrunning a maniac with a knife as long as his arms were still bound behind him. From there his story melded with Izuku's and his description was brief, just backing up what his friend had said. Once their statements were done and Tsukachi had packed up and gone, thanking them for their time with a kind smile, Yamada stepped forwards to crouch on the floor at the edge of the bed. Okay kiddos, we can talk more about this stuff later, but for right now I just wanted to let you know that every villain known to be on site last night was captured. Even the ones who made it into the tunnels were herded into a trap set by some local underground heroes, Shouta called in. So you two can relax and heal. We've got you. You're both safe, okay? After his little announcement, he let the two shocked boys absorb the information, waiting for each of them to nod their shaky acknowledgement. Once he was sure Nether was going to have an episode of some sort, he softly excused himself to go speak with the other two men out in the hallway, giving them the time and space to process, after they had been left on their own to absorb the events of the night before. And with the knowledge that the entire league had been captured, they had shifted from sitting upright on the edge of the bed to reclining against the raised head of the bed. Izuku cuddled snugly under his best friend's arm. There were too many thoughts running through the freckled boy's mind. So many things had happened in too short a time, and his brain was jumbled with the sheer amount of things he needed to compartmentalize. So, as he often did, he found himself rambling to himself. And, as he often did, Hitoshi sat back and relaxed as he idly listened in. They stayed like that for about 15 minutes or so, before Izuku said something that had his pillow tensing, causing his words to stumble to a stop, and then Hitoshi was twisting them around to face each other, a slightly desperate look on his face. "Izuku," he said seriously, his voice cracking and strained from disuse and accumulated stress. Please don't say you would have rather you died than me." When Toga tried to stab you, I felt my heart stop. I honestly thought I was going to lose you. And even though I was only a foot away, there was nothing I could do about it. I had just spent the entire time I was captured regretting not telling you I'm in love with you sooner, and then I almost lost every chance to say anything afterwards. And it would have been my fault because you only stepped in to save me. Tears were streaming down his pale cheeks by the time he finished, huffing in deep breaths after his outburst. But Izuku was too busy staring at him in shock, his brain forced to a halt. Everything in him screaming a repeat of one single word out of his friend's whole speech. Suddenly a lot of things had been made clear to him. His devastation, desperation, and single-minded determination over the last few days being thrown into the revealing gaze of a floodlight, nothing left to confuse him. He didn't have a crush on Hitoshi. He took a shaky breath, meeting a distressed purple gaze. Love, that sent the taller teen into a hard reboot. He seemed to stop breathing completely for a moment, a bit of panic flickering into his eyes as he realized just how he had confessed to his feelings. After his systems came back online, he seemed to deflate a bit, tips of his ears turning an endearing pink in shy embarrassment. Oh yeah, you don't have to feel the same way, but I would have regretted never saying anything. Izuku fiddled with his hearing aids nervously, looking down and away. I thought you had a thigh thing for Denki, or a Todoroki. That drew a snort from the purple-themed teen. I mean, yeah, but I've been thinking about that whole polyamory thing a lot. And well, I have a bit of a crush on both of them. Right now, the only one I can for sure say I love is it's you, Izuku. The smaller boy flushed bright red at the full confession, freckles standing out stark against the color before he hid his face in his hands. He mumbled something incoherent into his palms. What was that, Izu? The greenette took a deep breath before pulling his hands away, though he still couldn't quite meet the other's eyes again. I feel the same way about all of it. And suddenly Hitoshi felt like he was soaring, butterflies swooping in his gut at the reciprocated confession. Izuku, can I kiss you? He didn't have to wait for an answer because the other boy was quickly nodding before shyly starting to lean into his space. He leaned in as well, closing his eyes in an effort to not be weird. Their first kiss was chaste, a gentle press of lips just slightly off-center from where they should have been. Izuku huffing a giggle at having almost missed. The moment was quiet and sugar-sweet, absolutely perfect, and abruptly ruined by Mei loudly teasing them from the doorway. Oh, thank fuck. The pining is finally fucking over. The two boys sprang apart as their friend quickly joined them on the bed, and they all dissolved into their familiar ritual of light teasing and comforting cuddles. The hospital released them late that afternoon, and all six of them made the long trip back to the Yamezawa apartment. As soon as they were through the door, the three teens converged upon the couch. Since they were banned from Izuku's workshop for the night, they had planned a date with soft blankets, a pile of cats, and a Ghibli movie. The adults settled into the kitchen, letting them do their own thing as they decompressed with hot cups of tea and discussed what they would order for dinner. Izuku ended up buried under Hitoshi as the taller boy laid back against his belly with his knees across Mei's lap. The two inventors needed the reassuring pressure of their almost lost friend. They soon became a relaxed puddle as they focused on the movie they had picked out about a little witch earning her own way in the world. Their sleepy contentment only strengthened when Yamada brought them all hot cocoa with too many marshmallows about halfway through, letting them know they had decided on curry for dinner. Izuku grinning at the sweet gesture of the adults choosing Hitoshi's favorite food. The movie eventually reached its end with the young witch getting the guy she liked and a whole slew of friends. Also, the cat got laid, so that was something. By that time, the food had been ordered, so the teens slumped off of the couch and made their way to the kitchen with their empty cups. Izuku taking over rinsing them all out as the other two helped Aizawa pull out the table to add a leaf to the center to make room for their guests. The food was delicious. Several dishes of curry took up the center of the table to be dished over rice at their whim. Hitoshi in particular made sure to try all of them before going back in for seconds of his favorites. There was also a special treat of ice cream when they were done. After that, though, the two women had to leave. Mia had closed the shop for the day, but she was mid-project on some specialized tech for the Best Jeanist agency. He had asked her to customize one of her patented inventions to better suit the quirk of a sidekick. Getting her name on the suit would bring her a load more business, and the deadline was coming up fast, so she could afford to miss another day now that she was sure Hitoshi and Izuku were safe. Before they left, the two of them pulled Hitoshi into a hug and stood with him quietly for a few minutes, just letting their brains really latch onto the fact that he was back. After that came a round of much quicker hugs and some good-natured teasing, and then they were gone. The boys were sent up to their rooms to get ready for an early night. Both of them were too exhausted to even pretend to protest, and when Yamada went up to check that they were getting settled, he instead found the two of them fully clothed and curled up together in Hitoshi's bed. With a fond sigh, the hero stepped in to gently tug the aids from Izuku's ears. He left the door cracked as he left, the light from the hallway just enough to keep the room from being too dark, and the promise of the two of them waking up to purring cats too good to pass up. With that, he left and went to find his husband for his own cuddles. The morning came with a call from Uenazu had successfully gotten the school board to cave to his will. The dorms were a go, which meant they had to start packing what they would need on a day-to-day basis during the school year. Hazashi busied himself with making a list as Aizawa went up to have a quick talk to their boys, letting them know what was going to have to happen, and to also let them know of something important that had just come through the mail. What he wasn't expecting was finding the two teens entangled in each other, very obviously sharing a sweet kiss. The man cleared his throat pointedly, raising an eyebrow at them when they broke apart. Since when? Hitoshi coughed, hiding his embarrassment as best he could, though the red tip of his ears gave him away. Just since yesterday. Their guardian sighed, running a hand through his hair in exasperation. Okay, that's gonna add a bit to our talks this morning. Get showered and changed and head downstairs. We have some news to share and then we will talk about this. He turned to leave before another thought struck and he glanced back over his shoulder at them. Separate showers, problem children. He left to the music of Izuku's absolutely mortified squeak, a shit-eating grin on his face as he headed back downstairs. By the time the two boys had come down to the kitchen, Hazashi had been informed of the new development and they had a game plan. Breakfast was on the table, a more Western meal of oatmeal with a plethora of fruits ready to use as toppings. They started them off easy, letting them know about the dorms and how they would have their own rooms in the 1A building, but that the two heroes would only be a little ways down the path in the teacher's dorm, and that they would be keeping their apartment for breaks and weekends. The discussion breezed over the cats' plans to build them their own room in the teacher's dorm as well. But several of them were leash trained, so if the boys wanted to walk them down to their own dorms for the day, that would be acceptable. They asked if either of them has special requests for things to put in their dorms. Neither of them did, but Yamada swore they would go shopping anyways before the end of the summer. It was once the food was finished that they struck. Yamada standing to put his phone on the middle of the table, the holoprojector, normally used for going over building plans for raids, now showing the starting slide of a PowerPoint. Izuku squeaked again, hiding his burning face behind his freckled hands. Hitoshi just looked as if he wished for death. Yamada tried to ease them into it a bit. Okay, so normally sex ed is given to UA students in the first semester as a 2-week course taught by midnight, but due to extenuating circumstances, this year we bumped it back until around 2 months from now. But I don't mind giving y'all the SparNotes version now. Shinso tried to take that comment as an opening to run, standing abruptly and snagging Izuku's arm as if to drag him from the room. We really appreciate that. We do, but it's really not necessary. Come on, Izu, why don't we sit down? Aizawa said sternly. He didn't like making them do things they didn't want to do, but if they were going to be together in any romantic capacity, then this needed to be done. The two teens settled back into their seats miserably and Yamada kicked it up a gear. Okay, so, first things first. We called the doctor's office and both of you have tests scheduled for next week, just to make sure you are both clean. Now, I would prefer none of you kiddos have sex before you're 18, but I know teenagers, and I know that sometimes your hormones get the best of you. So all I ask is that you wait until you are 100% sure you're absolutely ready for that step. All I can do for you is to tell you some things to help you if you decide to go that far. So, safety. He then launched into a spiel about how two men safely have sex, explaining the importance of condoms and lube and proper training. He went on for an hour or more, quickly stressing the way to check for mutual consent and other important things, all the while ignoring the two imploding teens sitting across from him. He made sure to just cover the M-based topics. Most other things could wait till their actual sex ed classes. By the time he was done, Aizawa was fighting to keep back from laughing at the quiet looks of traumatization on both of their faces. He decided to give them a break and bring up the last topic of discussion as a distraction. In other news, Shinso, we got some mail for you this morning. Did you want to look through it? The purple teen latched onto the change of subject desperately, nodding frantically before taking the large manila envelope from the hero with eager hands, only to look confused when he realized he had no idea what was in it. Yamada waved for him to open it as he sat back down into his chair, pulling his tea closer to himself as he did. So with a shrug, the lanky teen tore open the top and slid out the sheaf of white printer paper, turning it to face him afterward, only to freeze after reading the first paragraph. Hitoshi took a shaky breath before rereading it, and again, trying to make the words make sense in his view of the world. But his view wouldn't shift, so instead he looked up at the two heroes sitting across from him, begging with his eyes for them to help him understand. Aizawa leaned forwards to rest his arms on the table, doing his best to appear relaxed so as to not influence the teen's decision. It's not official yet, since you're over 12 your signature is required. But other than that, all of the other paperwork has been filed and squared away. And the child services have been in for another tour while we were at camp, just to double check that you had what you needed. But yeah, if you want to, then all you have to do is sign and we can have that filed by tomorrow, and then it's just a week or two of waiting for processing. With that he stopped himself, This was, after all, something they had to leave up to the teen in the end. He watched with hidden amusement as Izuku leaned over to peer over his boyfriend's shoulder, green eyes widening before he sat back down quickly, obviously trying to smother his excited buzzing. The other teen was the opposite. Instead of excited bouncing, he was completely still in shock. They let him have his time, let him think his way through his new options. But it still broke their hearts when Violet Eyes looked back up completely filled with tears. You actually want me?" The question was broken, his voice shaky and choked, but the way he asked told of his desperation for an answer. The answer, the one he had been wanting since his quirk came in. Yamada sniffled, always easily swayed by others' emotions. "Oh, Lil One, of course we want you." Hitoshi's face went through several emotions at once: wonder, fear, bewilderment, love, trust, excitement. And then he was standing to go and dig through the junk drawer, returning with a pen quickly. It only took him a few seconds to find the page with the single blank space that awaited him, and even less time for him to sign his name with a shaking hand. Izuku then squealed in happiness, joined quickly by Hisashi, the two of them burying the pale teen in smothering hugs. A purple eye peeking out from behind a shoulder found a smiling Aizawa watching the three of them fondly. With a grin of his own, Shinso let himself be smothered, content with his new fate. Before they went separated to go about their days, Shouta had made sure to pull Izuku aside. He wanted to verbally assure the team that no one was able to adopt him until after the court hearing with Inko. Once he was officially released from her custody in a more permanent way, he promised to figure out their adoption options. Though he did mention that they might have to do some finagling since he and Hitoshi were now involved. Of course, the small teen had just shaken his head fondly at his guardian, saying flippantly that he wasn't worried about it, that he didn't need to stress over adopting him, that he was fine with how things were, and that he was just happy that Hitoshi had a forever family. The hero tried not to show the boy how much those words broke his heart, instead quietly stating that Izuku deserved a forever family as well. "But I have a family. Between all of you and the Hatsumes, I have more people who care about me than I could have ever imagined when I was growing up. That's all I need." After that slightly confused declaration, the dark man couldn't resist pulling his foster into a hug. He didn't say anything, too choked up to even try, but he did squirrel away the reminder of the Hatsumes as an answer to a future issue. Izuku was armpit deep in grease and gears, Hitoshi sitting on the beanbag they had moved into his workshop in the corner out of the way. The court date had been decided that morning, and Izuku had holed himself away to process his feelings a bit, though his boyfriend had refused to leave him completely alone. They had about 2 more weeks of summer, and then the hearing would be the second Sunday after the start of the semester. Both of their guardians had been a bit disgruntled with the timing, wondering why they would wait until after summer. So the Greenette had explained that Quirkless cases were often pushed back for things deemed more pressing, and that he was just surprised that he was being seen to before Christmas. The adults had not been thrilled with that answer, but they had let the 2 boys wander off easily enough. May was supposed to come over around lunch, and then the 3 of them had plans to meet up with Denki at a little Thai place down the road. Izuku had tried to invite Kuroyama and Todoroki as well, but Suoi was neck-deep in updating his sister's winter wardrobe before it got cold, and Shouto had politely declined. Izuku was sad they couldn't come, but he understood that his friends had lives of their own to live. But until then he was just happy to work on fine-tuning the portable barrier he had started back before the camp. He had managed to get it up and running, the machine able to put up a solid energy field about 10 meters in diameter. It was already fantastic as a mobile safe zone for emergencies, but he wanted to figure out how to build in a door that could be opened from the inside. His plan was to have it used by paramedics and other first responders who worked triage zones. That way they could choose who to let in when people carried the injured over, but they would still be covered from attacks or falling debris or whatnot. His idea for the moment was to add in an extra sensor and then build a remote with a distinct frequency. Then it should just be a bit of programming to have the remote open and close a 3-foot arch in the field, small enough to not be an easy target, wide enough to get a gurney through. Admittedly, his pivot to use this project for this reason was influenced by his experience in Kamino. Seeing the stressed first responders as he and Hitoshi were herded to the ambulance had made an impression. He wanted to make their job easier. He had just connected the last wire when his timer went off, telling him he had to go clean up before May got there. If she found him in his workshop, they would never be able to get her to leave for lunch. His shower was quick and he raced to get dressed and join Hitoshi on the couch. It was only a few minutes of the smaller teen watching his boyfriend run around his cartoon island before the doorbell rang, signaling their time to leave. Izuku pulled open the door so she wouldn't get impatient while they pulled on their shoes, and then with a quick pocket pat down they were out the door. Izuku chucked and pulled out some baby wipes as they loaded into the elevator, scrubbing what he could off of May's hands as they descended through the levels, the whole time listening and asking questions as the other genius described her latest baby, a new type of grappling harness made to help bring passengers either up or down sheer faces and out of danger. The soot that covered her was apparently the result of adding too much compressed air into the firing mechanism before testing. An easy enough fix. And then Shinso suggested that if they could make Izuku's latest device smaller, they could maybe combine them and thus save the rescuers from becoming targets if said rescue was from, say, a burning building in the middle of a villain fight. The resulting slew of math and theory on how to make a more personal-sized portable shield lasted until they were guided by their amused friend to the table Denki had saved for them. They broke off mid-calculation when their blonde almost knocked the other two boys over with a leaping hug. "Oh gods, I'm so glad to see you too. Do you know how worried I was when you disappeared, Izu? I know we've been texting all week since you got back, but it's just really good to see you both." The sight of tears welling in golden eyes, blocking the sparkle like rain clouds blocked the sunlight, had Izuku flailing around frantically as he tried his best to apologize. Shinso just huffed and hugged the blonde back with a quiet sigh. Eventually, instead of trying to actually calm the others down, Mei just tugged them to their booth and shoved the three of them into one side. Getting them settled all tangled together took some doing, but they managed. When a waitress braved the emotional miasma in order to get their drink order, Mei just asked for 4 waters and then rattled off the first things she could remember that each of the others had ordered before. Thus, when the boys returned to the world outside of their little bubble about 10 minutes later, they were greeted with a coffee, a Sprite, and the house herbal tea blend. They thanked their pink friend profusely as they rehydrated. The menus were pulled out and read through, and orders were made soon after. Lunch was delicious. All of them celebrated the freedom from being grounded for their purple and green trouble magnets. At one point, Kaminari video called Shouto, having a quick chat with the boy and his mother from her hospital room. The heterochromatic boy expressed his slightly stilted relief at their safety once again before wishing them a fun afternoon. They hung up soon after, promising as they did so to meet up with Todoroki before they all officially moved into the dorms. Once they finished off their giant shared vat of pad CU, they moved on to the test of their plans for the day. Mike had recommended a laser tag arena nearby. Apparently he had done an event there the year before for his radio show and decided that every kid needed to try the game at least once. They took the train to head downtown, chatting the whole way about the dorms and what might change curriculum-wise because of them. Mei in particular was practically incandescent at the thought of getting longer hours in the labs with free range on UAS nearly limitless supplies. Mia still had a fairly strict monetary limit for individual parts, though she was occasionally allowing her daughter access to some of the rarer supplies and hard-to-get experimental gear, usually as a treat for good grades in not-support-related subjects. Mei was getting way better at reading poetry. They got to the large, modern, industrial-looking building. All corrugated iron and cinder blocks splattered over in a rainbow of colors like someone had taken a paintball gun to the walls instead of a brush. When they entered, they were met with a small lobby with hallways leading off to either side. One way was open and led into a small concession stand and smaller arcade setup. The other was covered over with blackout curtains, obviously the way to the play area. Behind a counter there were racks of equipment and gear, all looking super high-tech and sleek, ready for renting. Izuku and Denki stepped up to the tired-looking young man behind the counter, leaving Hitoshi to keep Mei occupied for a few moments. Hi, we should have a reservation for Yamada. A tired blink was the response before the man started typing on the computer in front of him. After a moment or two he let out a positive sound. There you are, 4 full sets for 3 hours, 14,000 yen worth of tokens and 4 unlimited snack cards. Give me just a sec and let me get everything gathered up. With a stifled yawn, he turned to the wall and started pulling sets off of the rack, hooking them up to the computer one by one and asking what names they wanted to show up on the scoreboards. 3 of them went with their hero names and the other went with support goddess. After a quick discussion, they decided to start as a team and then split into different groups or singles later if they got bored. They then chose green as their team color with their secondary personal colors matching with their hair. Because of course, once everything was set up, the attendant showed them how to strap into the vests and helmets and how the guns worked, telling them he would have their tokens and snack cards ready for them whenever they were ready. They were then pointed to the curtain door and informed that there were 4 other teams and 6 individual players in already. They could already tell that from the shifting scores on the large screen on the wall nearby, but it was nice to be told anyway. Izuku eyed down the scores. It looked like the points reset every 15 minutes, so the goal was to get as many points within the time frame as possible. Apparently, when they handed in their equipment, they could ask for printouts of each round they were a part of. There were still 6 minutes left for this round, so that gave them time to go in and get a feel for the area and the players they would be against before a new round would start. The smallest teen suggested a basic formation, something simple that would play to their strengths while being versatile enough to account for whatever the terrain would be like. They went into a darkened room, lit only by black lights. Everything from the walls to the props and false buildings painted black and splattered with a dizzying array of neon paint. It was a maze of walls, hidey holes, windows, and sniper perches. Before they could really get their bearings, a singular figure came careening around the corner, obviously trying to snag some points off of the newcomers. Unfortunately for them, said newcomers were a group of hero and support students, all used to dodging attacks and explosions at the drop of a hat. The four of them split up according to their planned formation, Izuku and Denki staying low, racing forwards to draw most of the attention and fire, Mei breaking off to the right for a hiding spot she could use to cover them, Hitoshi all but leaping up a ladder to provide eyes from above. Within seconds their opponent was running back for cover, dim red lights blinking on his vest and helmet that showed where they had been hit. Denki signaled that he saw movement from the right and all of them headed that way. Hitoshi kept an eye from above and Mei brought up the rear, all of them doing their best to dodge from cover to cover. The rest of that round went quickly, their little group getting a feel for the others in the play area and the terrain they had to work with. The next 2 rounds were an absolute slaughter, Izuku calling out combos from their training and Mei keeping an eye out for ambushes. The hero students completely obliterated their competition. After that they went back out to the lobby to snag their snack cards so they could get some drinks, chugging them quickly before asking to be set to PvP. Their colors on the board losing the green team dots. From there it was a free-for-all of ambushes and all-out war tactics. The other players all just decided to try and keep out of their way. By the time their rental slot was over they were a sweaty mess of excited and playful energy. The buzzers on their vests went off signaling the end of 3 hours while Izuku had Hitoshi pinned, the teen having launched himself from a sniper hole in order to get the drop on his sneaking boyfriend. Once they realized the game was over the smaller teen got up with a giggle, hauling Hitoshi up as he did before giving him a brief kiss. He turned to head out only to find a stunned Kaminari standing behind him. A few quick blinks and the blonde was tilting his head slowly. "Are you two together?" The two in question shared a quick glance, uncertain over the weird tone underlying the question. Hitoshi shrugged. They had been planning on telling their friend group anyways, so Izuku nodded. "Yeah, for a couple of weeks now." "Oh, well, cool. Wanna get a snack?" Their electric friend then turned and hurried off, not waiting for an answer. Izuku and Hitoshi shared a worried look before following, stopping to hand in their gear and grab their 4 cups of tokens for the arcade. By the time they caught up to the blonde, the other boy was once again acting normal, listening in dazed confusion to another of Mei's theoretical physics rants. The 2 boyfriends shared a look, simultaneously deciding to pull Denki away later to talk to him properly. For now they were all here to have fun, so that's what they would focus on. From there all of them raced through eating their weight in bad hot dogs and M&Ms, washing it all down with warm soda. And then they hit the tiny arcade, burning through their tokens as quickly as they possibly could, laughing and teasing each other the whole way. Once they were done they ended up pooling all of their tickets together to get the giant stuffed cat. It was almost as tall as Izuku and black with glow-in-the-dark blue eyes. They all agreed to let Hitoshi keep a hold of it until they moved into the dorms. After that they would ask Wana if they minded the thing being kept in one of the common spaces. By the time they headed toward the train station it was already falling dark and all of them were exhausted after their fun afternoon. Unfortunately, they all had to separate to catch their own trains, so a quick hug was all they could manage or else risk being late. It wasn't until they got home that Izuku remembered that they needed to talk to Kaminari. He cuddled up to Hitoshi on the couch, trying to make a game plan. In the end, they settled on asking both him and Shadow to meet up for a coffee at their favorite cafe that Saturday. It was time to have a discussion. Kachow, hey, can I ask you something? Pain relief, sure. Kachow, you like Mido and Hito, right? Like as more than friends. Pain relief, yes, I think so. Why do you ask? Kachow, well, what would you do if they got together? Like what if they started dating? Pain relief, well, I would like to say that I would support them and be happy for them. They are my friends after all. But if I'm telling the truth, I would probably be a little sad, though I would try not to show it to them. They are not obligated to like me back in the same way. Kachow, yeah, me too. Pain relief, is there any reason you are asking me this? Kachow, nope, no reason. My mom has taught me not to spread rumors. Anyways, I have to go. I'll talk to you later. Pain relief, okay, have a good night. Strongcully, hey Denki, Shadow, Toshi and I were planning to go to a cafe on Wednesday. We were really hoping the both of you could come too. Pain relief, I do not believe I have plans for that day. Kachow, which cafe? More Slept PLZ, the one down on 8th. It had great desserts. Kachow, say no more, I am so in. Pain relief, if I am able to dodge extra training that day then I would also like to come. Strongcully, awesome. Let's try for like 11. Kachow, Mido. You do know teenagers aren't supposed to get up before noon during vacation, right? More Sleep PLZ. That's what I keep saying. But he wants to pull some extra hours at the shop afterwards. So he's torturing me by stealing my sleep again. Strongcully, both of you are dramatic AF. Kachow, you bet your cute little ass. Izuku hadn't slept a wink. To be fair, neither had Hitoshi, but that was a lot more common. The violet boy had spent the night curled up with a book in Izuku's workshop, his phone hooked up to the speakers playing his calming lo-fi list in an effort to help the two of them relax as much as possible. They had settled into a decent space, just them and their distractions and the music, both of them spaced out a bit in an effort not to stress too much. Time passed by unnoticed. It took Yamada coming into their safe haven to usher them out for breakfast for them to even notice that it was morning. Early morning, but still morning. The two men had a meeting with a lawyer at 7 to get to, so breakfast was simple, toast and jam, or a pick from their stash of cereals. Neither boy was too picky though, happy that their fosters were so willing to take the extra time to make sure they ate. And then with quiet well wishes the two men were running out the door, arms full of folders and coffee. Once he finished eating, Izuku got up to do the dishes. Hitoshi thanked him with a quiet grumble before he headed into the living room to collapse onto the couch. Once everything was clean, the greenette joined him, sitting on the floor and turning on the TV to pass the time until they needed to leave. They settled on some sort of hybrid how it's made marathon, listening quietly as the narrator went on and on about the process of making holoprojectors. When the next segment came on, this time about the functions of the oldest engines and how they've changed over the last few hundred years, Hitoshi slipped off the couch to go get them both some coffee in the name of being coherent. He wasn't sure how well it worked, but they were at least on time when they locked the door after themselves. It really was a pity that Shikaze-san's cafe was further from home now that they lived with the heroes. It would be even more so once they were in the dorms, but it was worth the train ride over just for the coffee. That wasn't even factoring in the pastries. Izuku bet that Kaminari was going to have a field day when he saw all of the cake on display. The blonde had a real sweet tooth. For now it was fine since his metabolism was so high, but he would have to watch it as he got older so he didn't put on too much weight. A little was fine, but if it started to affect his hero work then they would have to find a happy balance. Unfortunately, the train is rather busy. It's lunchtime and the end of summer break, so the carriages are packed with business people trying to get their meal before their break is over and kids making the best of the last little bit of time off. But Hitoshi pointed out that they couldn't complain because technically they were the same, though they both wished they could go for a nap right at that moment instead of trying to face a scary conversation. But both of them wanted to do this, wanted to jump the hurdle and see where they landed. So on the crowded train to the crowded cafe they went. It was warm and welcoming as always when they stepped through the door. Todoroki was already there, standing in line and reading off of the board, a small frown on his face as he tried to make a decision before it was his turn. Izuku smiled at the cute almost pout before calling out a greeting. They joined him at the end of the line. And when Shoto admitted he had never had coffee from a shop before, Hitoshi took the opportunity to educate the two-tone teen in the intricacies of the flavors of different blends. And true to his nature, Todoroki listened closely and absorbed everything as well as he could, asking the occasional question. By the time they had reached the counter, the two of them had settled on getting 3 cups of coffee for him to try, with Hitoshi saying he would drink whichever ones he decided he didn't like. Izuku chuckled to himself at their antics as he stepped up to order his own Thai iced coffee and a whole selection of snacks. The barista taking orders grinned at him as the other customers stepped aside. "Oh, you're that kid from the other day, right? Suzushi-chan has been worried about you. Hold on and let me grab her out of the kitchen." She raced off before he could respond, heading through the door to the kitchen. She returned quickly, all but dragging the familiar owner of the small shop. Once she realized why she was being manhandled, the 3 boys watched her light up with glee. "Midoriya-kun, oh my gosh, I was wondering how you were doing after all of that mess last time. He let me get your order and then we can have a quick chat, okay?" She rang him and his 2 friends up, grinning when Shoto bullied them out of the way in order to swipe his father's credit card to pay for their large bounty of treats. They shoot over to a table in the corner as she turns to gather their things and make their drinks. They had just settled when the bell on the door jingled cheerfully again to announce the arrival of a slightly late Denki, the blonde obviously out of breath from a run. Shinso grinned at his antics before standing to go up to the counter, probably to pay for his drink. They returned with Shikaze-san in tow. "Midoriya-kun, Shinso-kun, how are you two doing? How is Hatsum-chan? Who are your friends?" They spend the next few minutes introducing the friendly barista to the other 2 boys and assuring her that things have been okay. She had been worried after the incident with Inko in the cafe and seeing bits of news footage about Shinso's abduction. So they caught her IP to speed, mentioning the Inko's court date was set and that Shinso was well on the way past recovery. Unfortunately, a fresh wave of lunch crowd came in, so she had to leave soon after, heading back to the kitchen with a cheery, "Stop by more often, kiddos." Izuku chuckled as he waved back before turning his attention to Kaminari to greet him properly. They sat and sipped at their drinks as they chatted about what they imagined the dorms would be like and how they were going to try and keep Mei from blowing up the ones for the support course. They joked around and munched on pain au chocolat, even managing to get a few amused huffs out of Shoto when they wandered into ragging on famous hero missteps and Endeavor's most infamous interview. Eventually, though, the fun part had to end. Izuku and Hitoshi shared a look. They had about an hour left before they had to leave for the shop. If they wanted enough time to have this conversation properly, it was now or never. Long pale fingers wrapped around a freckled and scarred hand, squeezing reassurance. And Izuku took the plunge. Hey Hitoshi and I are we're dating and well, we've been talked about it and what I mean to say. Denki's hand on his shoulder brings him to a screeching stop. Hey man, it's okay. We're happy for you. Really, no judgment here. A blinding smile was aimed at the greenette to sell the sentiment, only to be met with quiet frustration from Izuku, much to the blonde's confusion. It took green eyes glaring over to purple and a frustrated wave of prompting before Shinso took pity on his boyfriend. Denks, Izuku's not just trying to say that we're dating. He's trying to ask if you two would like to join us. Kaminari blanked out at the confession. But Todoroki leaned forwards, obviously interested if a bit confused. I don't understand. You want us to join you in dating? Izuku nodded furiously, a huge blush covering his face. But let Shinso continue to hold the reins. Yes, he and I have been looking more into polyamory since it had been brought up to us, and we have decided that we would both like to give it a shot. If you want to. Shadow hummed quietly. I'll admit I don't know anything about relationships, and even less about polyamory. Was it? Can you explain, please? And so they talk. Shinso explains about the basics of polyamory and how he and Izuku thought they might be able to make an arrangement work between the four of them. He also admitted that he had harbored a crush for the other two teens since the first week of school. His boyfriend jumped in at that point to admit something similar. It was at that point that Denki finally seemed to come back to earth, breaking into happy tears as he gleefully stated that he had developed a crush on all of them at first sight, because apparently he had a thing for unfairly pretty boys. He accepted their proposal with little more thought, settling into babble at Izuku in excitement while Hitoshi calmly answered Shadow's question. It was a phone alarm alerting them that they needed to leave so Izuku could make his shift that drew them out of their discussion. The greenette turned to the still unsure Todoroki. Shadow, look, you don't have to answer anytime soon, okay? And if you decide this isn't what you want, we will all still be your friends, okay? There was a pause as they gathered up their things and shoved the spare treats in a bag to throw at Mei so she could remember to eat. As Izuku snagged their empty cups to toss, Shadow gave his answer. I can't say I am uninterested, but I would like some time to think it over. Hitoshi nodded firmly. That's fine. Take all the time you need. There's no pressure for this. We just knew we would regret it if we didn't at least offer. They left from their pausing outside on the sidewalk for a quick round of hugs as they said their goodbyes. Denki started to walk away before he turned back, a determined look on his face as he scooped up Izuku's hand and pressed a chaste kiss to freckled knuckle. I had fun. We need to go on a real date soon, he said with a small flirty smirk. He turned to Shinso, giving the smallest teen a moment to himself while he self-destructed at the open flirting from his newest boyfriend. The blonde moved to snag the taller boy's hand as well, but had to abort when Hitoshi stepped closer instead, said hand slipping in through Denki's guard to tilt his chin up for a brief kiss to the lips instead. Izuku made a high-pitched squeaking sound seeing this, and Hitoshi grinned down at the both of them deviously as they both did their best to process. See you soon, Denks. Come on, Izu. We're going to be late. He then dragged the greenette towards the train station, leaving Kaminari waving in stunned disbelief. Eventually the blonde remembered he wasn't alone and turned to his other friend with a dumbfounded look on his face. Wow, Shadow nodded slowly. Yes. Wow, I have to go. I need to. Yes. With that he spun around, heading further downtown. Denki watched him go, wondering whether or not he was imagining the light blush on the other boy's cheeks. Izuku and Hitoshi got the dubious honor of moving into the dorms a few days early. The teachers were getting a whole 3 days to unpack and get settled before they would have to deal with the mess that would come with watching over swarms of teenagers. They didn't bring everything from the Yamezawa apartment, mostly just the day-to-day basics, some of it new duplicates. They planned on spending most weekends and holidays in the apartment in the middle of the city, so they left a lot of things there. Shouta did demand that their new campus dorm have accommodations for the 8 cats though. That was his stipulation for agreeing to the switch in his contract. Nezu wouldn't give the cats their own room in the name of limited space. The compromise was to make the whole dorm a cat haven. There were climbing spots and tunnels through the walls, and the laundry room was extended slightly to make room for more of the self-cleaning litter boxes Aizawa preferred. The 2 teen boys didn't get their own rooms in the teachers' dorms. They were getting rooms with the other students after all. But Mike made sure to buy the most comfortable pull-out couch on the market just in case they needed to stay the night with their fosters. The 2 boys' dorms were a bit on the empty side, neither of them really needing a whole lot and therefore leaving most of the extras at the apartment. They did have a few personal touches though. Shinso made sure his floor was well stocked with cushions and beanbag chairs, and had taken Yamada up on the offer of expensive LED light strips to mark the edges of his room and furniture. Izuku had put up some printouts of the blueprints for his favorite gear. thinking that if he stared at them long enough he could come up with more ways to improve them, and had brought his more portable toolbox to set up in the corner of his room with a small table so he could tinker when he couldn't sleep. But other than those and a few other small things, they only had to unpack their clothes and dress the beds. So they were done with their spaces within an hour. As soon as his last hoodie was on a hanger, Izuku headed upstairs to Hitoshi's room to see if he was finished. The purple boy had the room directly above his own, and according to the seating charts their other paramours would be reasonably close as well, with Shoto in the room 2 down from Izuku's and Denki next door to Shinso. Izuku just prayed that Todoroki said yes. He didn't want things to get awkward if he said no and they were stuck being on the same floor. He knocked briefly when he made it to the right door, opening it when he got a responding call. "Hey Toshi." "Oh wow, this looks so cool." His boyfriend was curled up on a pile of pillows on the floor, scrolling on his phone as the LED lights filtered through 100 different shades of blue and green, making the whole room feel like it was an enchanted underwater cave or something. The other teen shoved his phone in a pocket, stretching out to snag a remote from his desk. "Yeah, these are actually really cool. There's a fire theme and a galaxy theme too, as well as more standard ones like rainbow or solid colors." They spent a few minutes playing with the settings before they decided it was time to go see if their fosters needed help with their own dorm. They had more to unpack after all, since they also had to bring their own things for the kitchen shared on each floor of the teachers' dorms and things for the cats. The trek across the greens between the dorm buildings was quick, 3 minutes or so at a steady pace, close enough that the teachers would be close enough to help any of the classes in an emergency. This building, unlike their own, was buzzing with activity. The teachers and school robots busy carrying in boxes and furniture. The 2 boys nodded to Cementos as they dodged through the large communal living room, aiming for the stairs and the 3rd floor. Each floor had 3 dorms and a shared kitchen, and floor 3 was playing host to Aizawa, Yamada, Snipe, and Hound Dog. Izuku was relieved when he heard who the floor mates would be, glad they were 2 of the calmer teachers so he wouldn't have to deal with extra energy every time he came to visit his fosters and unwind. They found Yamada in the kitchen setting up Aizawa's fancy coffee machine, obviously looking ahead to his husband's most imminent needs. He greeted them both with a cheerful hello and a hug, before asking them to help Shoto with building the flat-packed furniture and the new litter boxes for the kiddies. Sending them to help the dark-haired man turned out to be a good call. They walked into the dorm to find him hunched on the floor cursing a robot pooper scooper as it refused to be built. Izuku just laughed and shooed him off to a simpler project so he could take over assembling the tech. There was still a record amount of cursing over something so easy as a shelf, but this way the green-haired teen could make sure the cats had a clean place to potty. It took several hours, but eventually everything was put together properly and in place. Most of the boxes of necessary items roughly unpacked and broken down to be taken to the recycling later. Mike called it good enough, scooping up his phone to place a dinner order for them and probably the rest of the men on their floor, too tired to even think about cooking. A quick text to and from Snipe confirming that he would be willing to run to the gate to grab the food when it arrived released them from the rest of their obligation. All 4 of them collapsed onto the couch and the 2 recliners that had been shoved in a semicircle in front of the TV, only to groan when they remembered that the system had yet to be hooked up. The small green genius in their midst sighed before sliding off the couch to crawl the 4 feet to the small entertainment system. He knew he would be the fastest at untangling the wires and plugging everything in where it was meant to be. Besides, it was a new system and he was curious about the quality. It only took him 10 minutes and a little help from Hitoshi to get the surround speakers moved to the general area where they would end up on the walls. And then he was flopped back out on the couch watching with tired interest as Mike scrolled through apps. Eventually he logged into Webby and settled on the prompted suggestion for a super old documentary about cocaine mummies. Kitschy stereotypical music played over drone shots of sand and lulled the lot of them into puddles on their chosen seat, all of them well ready to just take a break. About 20 minutes in, a ping from Snipe let them know that dinner had been retrieved, so with a collective groan they all clambered to their feet and headed out into the hall to the shared space. They joined the 2 other men on their floor at the table piled high with Chinese takeout boxes and started to sort their way through to find whatever struck their fancy. Dinner was spent in quiet conversation, finding comfort in family and friends in this new space. Izuku almost regretted agreeing to stay in the class dorms. Apparently Class H had decided to use half of their common room space as a creation area. They got Power Loader to agree by swearing off anything that could be dangerous, but that still left things like designing and putting pieces together and sewing. He helped May carry her boxes upstairs to her room and debated whether or not it would be worth it to ask to move, but eventually decided that as a member of Class H he was well within his rights to come visit whenever he wanted to. He joked around with the support students as he went back and forth between the moving trucks and the dorms, helping the others after May's things were gathered and she was too busy unpacking to pay much attention to him. Hiroyama in particular was grateful for the help. He was apparently mid-remaking his sister's winter wardrobe and had triple the amount of clothing of anyone else, though he would be taking finished pieces back to his family home every week so the girls would be ready as soon as the weather started getting cooler. As they figured out a safe way to pile boxes in the limited space around the boys' personal sewing setup, the tall support student explained his plans for various pieces, going over the wonders of thrift flips and how to revamp old clothes. Izuku listened with rapt attention, fascinated by the concept, even as he knew he wasn't really one for fashion. Still, he kept some ideas in his back pocket for later use. It was a bit after lunch when he finally helped carry the last box inside and extracted himself so he could go find his boyfriends. He was excited to see Kaminari again, and he figured Shinso was probably already hanging around the blonde, most likely doing his best to keep the energetic teen on task. Indeed, he found them snagging the last of Denki's boxes from a nearly empty truck. He stepped in to grab the one that the electric boy was clearly struggling with, hefting it onto one shoulder so he could give Denki a one-sided hug and greeting. The blonde promptly flushed bright red at the show of strength, before switching to a more flirtatious smile and letting out a long whistle. "Goddamn, Izuku, way to show off those muscles." The freckled teen looked away in embarrassment. I wasn't trying to show off. You just looked like you could use a hand." Shinso chuckled from where he was walking along behind them, watching the show. "Relax, Izu. I assure you neither of us are complaining, especially since you took off your overshirt." Izuku grumbled about 2 layers of long sleeves being too hot while he was working as they walked up the stairs to Kaminari's room. It was currently a mess of half-unpacked doodads and trinkets. Green eyes blinked around at the chaos before carefully setting his burden down and deciding to just build the small flat-pack shelf in the corner while the other two dealt with Denki's interesting choices for decor. Once the extra bit of furniture was out together and settled where their boyfriend wanted it, the greenette switched to hanging clothes in the small closet. He was trying not to snoop. Really, he was. But he couldn't help taking an interest in certain articles, even as he discreetly put them away. The pleated skirt was definitely something he wanted to ask about when he knew it wouldn't upset the blonde. They spent the next few hours sorting through the disaster that was Denki's packing, finding places for his random things and organizing his desk to be usable. Finally, they decided it was good enough for the moment and that they were too hungry to care about the tiny little fiddly bits that could be done over the next few days. They tramped downstairs to the common areas to see what kind of food Aizawa had gotten them for the first day there. Luncrush had provided sandwiches for lunch, but they would be making a grocery order list tonight to have delivered to the dorms tomorrow morning. So for now, each dorm's homeroom teacher was tasked with making sure their kids didn't starve. Lucky for them, Aizawa was too lazy to cook for 20 teenagers. There was a massive pile of pizza boxes on the kitchen counter, several open and spread out over the nearby table as well. Most of their class was already down and digging in, only pausing to shout greetings to their prodigal members as they joined the group. Izuku grinned and snagged a few pieces of hamburger and onion pizza for himself before sitting in an open chair, his 2 partners settling on either side of him as they got their own food. It was another 20 minutes or so of slowly eating their weight in grease and chatting with their friends before Todoroki showed up, obviously looking for dinner. He looked confused at what he found, asking what the pizza was, much to the consternation of the rest of the teens. Denki explained exactly what pizzas were, adding an extra emphasis on their deliciousness as he went. The heterochromatic teen nodded along seriously at the explanation, before asking if it was healthy. When it was confirmed that no, most pizza was not technically healthy, he nodded. "Makes sense on why I've never had it then. My father wouldn't let anything unhealthy into the house." Denki scowled at that, and several of their classmates promised to bring the poor teen their favorite unhealthy foods when they got the chance. That earned a lot of them a small smile as Shadow slowly sifted through his options and grabbed several different types of toppings to try. An hour later, the others buzzed with excitement as they decided to have a room competition, dragging everyone along in their sea of energy. Most of the rooms were pretty as expected from the teens they belonged to. Though Sato got extra kudos for his cake, Shinso got loads of compliments on his lights, and Shadow got looks of disbelief from his complete makeover. In the end, the others wandered back towards the common areas as they discussed who should win the competition. But before they could follow after them, Todoroki stopped the 3 partners and asked if they could talk for a moment. They complied easily, slipping into the other boys' room and settling on the tatami mats when motioned to sit. They waited patiently while Shadow gathered his thoughts. Well, as patiently as possible. Denki had a hard time sitting still in the best of circumstances after all, but his fidgeting was accepted easily by the others. About what we all talked about at the cafe. I would like to accept, but I'm afraid the only experience I have with relationships has been not good. So I would ask that if we try this, can you all be patient with me? I don't want to ask too much, but I have no idea what a relationship is supposed to be like if it's not abusive. And if things don't work out, can I still be your friend? Izuku sniffled a bit before throwing himself forwards and into the other boy's lap for a hug. Of course, Shadow. We wouldn't want to rush you or push you in any way. Just the fact that you're willing to try to be with us is more than enough for me. Denki joined in the hug, adding his own reassurances to Izuku's mess of babbling, swiping a hand out to snag their last boyfriend and drag him into the impromptu cuddle pile. He went easily enough, allowing himself to drape over the other three like a reassuring weight. Eventually, they all calmed down and the greenette realized he was in the very middle of all three of the boys he liked. His freckles stood out prettily from his blush as he tried to gently slip out of the hug. Hitoshi took pity on him and let him up. Not without a knowing smirk, though. From there they spent the time until lights out talking about everything and nothing, simply just enjoying the fact that their little polycule was now official. Aizawa glared down at their class, daring them to speak as they gathered into a loose group in front of one of the gyms. In a week's time, all of you will be taking the exam for your provisional licenses. The training camp was originally meant to get you ready for this, but, well, plans change. So now you all will have a week to nail down the last lesson we were going to work on. Power moves. The class erupted into excited chatter at the announcement, quickly comparing favorite power moves from older heroes as well as starting to brainstorm ideas for their own. Eraserhead waved a hand to bring their attention back to him for another few minutes. Yes, I'm sure most of you have ideas. This gym has several different types of terrain set up so you can have choices on where to work. That being said, I and several other teachers will be scattered around making suggestions and keeping an eye out. Don't get hurt, and don't hurt anyone else. And ask Cementos if you need something more specific made for you. And Midoriya, Power Loader has given you and Hatsum access to the labs for the week. If you need to make or update something, feel free to let me know and then head over. But please remember that you should save time to actually practice with whatever support item you come up with. Once he got acknowledgement from all of the kids, he turned them loose to train to their heart's content, keeping an eye on his more gung-ho students even as he waved an okay to Izuku as the teen excitedly dashed by on his way to the labs. He prayed for PL's sanity, grateful to the ma'am for giving up his last week of break, but well aware the Chaos Duo would most likely drive him mad. This would be a tiring week for everyone involved. Shinso leaned sleepily against Shadow's warmer side, watching blearily as Mei and Izuku sat on the floor in front of the coffee table. They were gesturing wildly as they discussed schematics for some sort of sensors or buttons for Izuku's glove. They occasionally turned towards Denki, who was sitting beside them charging 4 phones at once and playing Mario Kart on Hitoshi's Switch. The blonde was playing soundboard for the two geniuses, mostly just humming and hawing, but occasionally taking the chargers out of his mouth to ask clarifying questions. In the hour since they had showered and gotten back to the common room, the blonde had sparked no less than 4 breakthroughs by bringing the others back to the basics. The purple-eyed teen looked on with fondness, even if he was too tired and comfortable to really contribute anything himself. Todoroki made a fantastic pillow, letting him melt bonelessly against his shoulder as he read a book, one that would be coming up on their list in the next semester. Overachieving goody-goody. Hitoshi let himself be lulled by the voices of his 2 best friends and the warmth underneath him, dozing off fully after a few more minutes. They all let him nap, Shadow glancing over every once in a while to check on him, even as he continued to channel the tiniest bit of his quirk to raise his own temperature a bit to keep the tallest teen comfortable. Eventually, though, the others started trickling into the common areas, all intent on finding food. When it started getting noisy enough that Shinso started to frown in his sleep, the others decided it was dinner time for them too. Izuku sitting up on his knees to gently shake his indigo-haired boyfriend awake. It took a minute, but eventually they got him up and shuffled over to the table, letting him flop down with his head on his folded arms while the rest of them figured out food things. Eventually Izuku took over, shoving the other 3 out of the kitchen so they couldn't destroy anything or go with the week-old Kombini bento Kaminari had been eyeing. He ended up mixing chicken broth and miso mix together in a pot with some basic veggies, and setting another pot on to boil for noodles. Miso ramen would have to do since he hadn't had the foresight to really prep anything. He dug around in the fridge and found some seared pork belly left over from the night before. He tossed it in the microwave to heat up and add into their soup when it was done. He also found some natto in the pantry and doled it out into little ramekins as a side dish. Luckily, noodles were quick and easy, and he had 5 bowls of food ready in no time, Shadow coming over to help him carry things to the table as Kaminari finished making them all tea. Soon enough they were settled and chatting over their meal, even Shinso awake enough to join in the conversation by that point. They spent the time discussing the super moves the 3 hero course students with quirks were trying out, letting their smartest boyfriend help them hammer out better exercises or point out fundamental flaws. And from there devolved into combo moves they could try together when they got the new moves down by themselves. Mei spent nearly the entire time sketching on her paper napkin, trying to work out a better support chassis for the project she had been working on all summer. She eventually decided that pneumatic braces would have to be subbed in for the springs she was currently using. Now if only her mom and power loader would let her build more than a miniature prototype of the rail cannon. Who knew people could say no to cannons? Bitches love cannons. Shadow sighed from his seat on a stool near his green-haired boyfriend. He had been sent to grab Izuku out of the lab. Their afternoon practice time was over, and truthfully Power Loader was probably ready to get the two wild children out of his hair. But the smaller boy in May had been mid-welding project and had begged for 10 more minutes to finish. And who was he to say no to big green puppy eyes, strangely enhanced by the soot circles left behind when he removed his safety goggles? Honestly, he wasn't too mad at the situation. They had given him his own pair of goggles to wear while they worked, so he got to spend the time relaxing and watching his unfairly pretty greenette lit up by dancing sparks. And honestly, dirt and grime shouldn't be so attractive. Soon enough, they seemed to come to a stopping spot and allowed their teacher to usher them out of the lab, foregoing a shower and instead just heading to the dorms in their coveralls and undershirts, Shadow trailing along right behind them, making sure to keep them on the right path as they babbled to one another. They swung by the 1H dorm to drop the pinkette off, Izuku reminding her that Mina wanted to talk to her after dinner sometime that night. And then they headed back around the circle of buildings to Heights Alliance. They walked in to find their other two partners cuddled on the couch, other classmates spread out around them. All of the teens joking around as a movie played on the TV. Izuku waved as Kaminari noticed them removing their shoes, turning to the elemental beside him right after. "I'm going to grab a SH shower. Save me a seat." When he got an easy nod in reply, he grinned and hopped up on his tiptoes to press a chaste kiss to Shadow's pale cheek before dashing off to his room for toiletries and a change of clothes. The taller teen stood there for a moment, blinking at the sudden affection before shaking himself a bit and heading to the couch. Kaminari giggled and patted the seat beside himself, reaching to wipe away an errant smudge of grease after Shadow had settled. "Careful, pretty boy. If you let him get you all grungy, then you might lose your perfect skin." A white eyebrow raised. "Perfect skin? I'm quite sure I'm not the one who I would point to for that." He gestured to the scar that stood out so prominently on his face. Both boyfriends frowned darkly at the sarcastic quip, before Hitoshi latched a hand in the stoic teen's collar. "That scar is as perfect as the rest of you," he stated point blank and with all of the seriousness he could muster, before dragging Shadow to lean over Denki's lap so he could kiss said scar and make his point. They stared each other down for a second, Hitoshi daring Todoroki to dispute his claim, before they both suddenly realized that the whole common room had gone silent, TV and all. The few others of the class who were downstairs hanging out were all staring at the three boys on the couch, and none of said boys could tell you how long they had been doing so. Mina, predictably, was the one to break through the stunned silence first. "Todoroki, did you just kiss Midoriya and Shinso? Oh, I guess I should kiss Denki so it'll be fair." He proceeded to turn slightly and do so, much to the giggly amusement of the blonde and the loud shock of the rest of his classmates. The uproar lasted for a few minutes, an overwhelming wall of questions pinning the three boys until Izuku stepped out of the boys' bathroom to stare around in confusion at the mess. What did I miss?" He took a step back in fear when Mina whipped around to face him at this announcement of his presence. The pink-skinned gossip goddess all but tackling him in her rush to get answers. It took him a minute to sift through her rush of words, but eventually he got the gist of what was being asked. He looked uncertainly at his partners, not sure if they were okay with announcing the nature of their relationship so soon, but Kaminari just nodded with a goofy smile. And the other two shrugged, seemingly not caring at all. So he took a breath and gave the girl what she wanted. "Yeah, the four of us are we're dating." Cue pandemonium as everyone else tried to speak at once. Izuku suddenly found himself relieved that several of their classmates were still in their rooms or out doing other things. He didn't even want to know how loud it would be with absolutely everyone in the same space at that moment. Luckily, most of them just seemed excited for them, though there were a few who seemed a bit confused, asking questions about how the situation would work from their nearest friend. It took a few minutes for things to calm down. By that point, the greenette had been bundled over to sit with his partners and was helping Kaminari field the deluge of questions. Izuku explaining how he and Shinso had gotten together at the hospital and decided that they both liked the other two as well. Kaminari enthusiastically recounting the coffee date, embellishing the story a bit with descriptions of seeing Izuku's freckles through the front window, and of how Shadow had blushed, ignoring the fact that his little details were making all three of the other boys blush all over again in that moment. The others congratulated the four of them profusely, excited that their friends were happy. They eventually did calm down though, turning the movie back on and chatting with one another happily. The picture of teenage joviality. Izuku snuggled down into Shadow's side, Shinso's arm draped over his shoulders and Denki's legs thrown across all of their laps, content to just take in the not-so-quiet moment. He was glad their reveal went well. And he was glad to have friends who were happy for them. But most of all, he was glad for the moment to breathe. The morning of their test dawned bright and early, and the 20 kids were on their bus even earlier, the 3-hour drive to the facility demanding them leave at 5 a.m., Hitoshi hated that for them. The purple-themed boy dragging all three of his partners to the long bench at the back of their bus so he could use them as a bed to try and catch a bit more sleep. He ended up with his legs sprawled across Izuku's lap with his feet tucked underneath Denki's legs, and Shadow half-turned in his own seat so the tired teen could use his chest as a backrest. They ignored the teasing from the rest of their class at first, but Izuku slowly became more uncomfortable, something seeming off. After a few more minutes he gave into his paranoia and let himself fully look around to see if he could pinpoint the cause of the extra anxiety. He was praying it was just the test, that his nerves were fried, but unfortunately he instead locked eyes with a hostile glare. Minta was scowling fiercely directly at them, his displeasure over something clearly visible. Can I help you?" The greenette started uncertainly, not sure what they had done to receive the diminutive teen's ire. He was not expecting the answer. "I can't believe you're both a null and a faggot." The small number of their class that were close enough to hear the hissed remark paused in their lively conversation, turning to face Minta, faces showing either disbelief or discomfort. But it was Kaminari who beat them all to the punchline. "Excuse me, do you want to say that again?" Unfortunately, the grape-themed hero in training had never been one to know when to shut up. "I said, he's not only a disgusting null, but a worthless faggot. He should have no problem with those titles, right? Since that's exactly what he is. Honestly, I can't believe they let someone so diseased into the hero course in the first place. And now he's going around flaunting his perversions in our faces on top of it all." The rest of the bus was slowly quieting down now as the tension in the back made itself felt, ratcheting up as Denki threw himself to his feet, towering over Minta with lightning sparking between clawed fingers. The only thing that kept the blonde from physically attacking was Izuku's quick grab, his fist twisting in the electric boy's blazer. "You," calling him disgusting. "Get your eyes checked, you perverted little worm. As if it's not bad enough you're a quirkist piece of shit, now you're going around slinging homophobic slurs. How dare you? Izuku is the smartest, sweetest, most amazing person, and you're just a shit stain on the underwear of the universe. I bet." "Enough. What is going on back here?" All of the teens focused their attention on the hero who had made his way down the aisle. Still a bit rumpled from the nap they had obviously interrupted. Surprisingly, it was Hitoshi who answered, still in his reclined position, probably strategically pinning two of his boyfriends. The grape was spewing slurs again. "Honestly, I'm going to have to start carrying a recording device every time I'm in the same room as the little perv. You wouldn't believe the amount of bull he shits out of his mouth." The teacher was slowly looking more thunderous. "Well, that's what we have witnesses for. Now what's this about slurs?" Both Denki and, surprisingly, Mina spoke at the same time, stumbling over each other as they tried to explain the situation through their anger. After a second of unintelligible noise, the pro cut them off with a raised hand. "Right, remind me to move up our debriefing training." The comment was half amused even through the obviously growing headache. The man turned to see who else was nearby, finding Jiru looking furious and tense in the seat across from Minta. "Jiru, what was said?" She snapped her attention to him, blinking at being asked specifically, before glowering back at the cause of this particular bit of drama. Verbatim, "I can't believe you're both a null and a faggot." It's not the first time he has said something about Mido being quirkless, but normally he keeps comments about sexuality focused on the girls. This is the first time I've heard the homophobia. By now Aizawa himself was looking as murderous as some of his students, but being he adult he took a deep breath and did his best to calm down. And if he has said thing like this before, to anyone, why wasn't I or another teacher told? The kids around us all shared uncertain glances, obviously not sure how to answer. It was Izuku's turn to step up to the plate. Well, when it came to this and stuff about me I asked them not to. I am sure I'll hear it a lot as a hero. Honestly I hear it a lot anyways. As so I've never really let it bother me. Or I try and not to. And I thought you knew what he said to the girls." The man felt a pang in his chest that any of his kids might think he would look the other way for anything like this. But he knew the only thing he could really do was correct their thinking. "No, I had no idea that harassment of any kind was going on." He pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to figure out what to do about this mess. "Right, okay. Minta, you are going to sit up front with me. If you know what's good for you, you will keep your mouth shut. The rest of you, after the test is over and we get back to the school, I want you to tell me exactly what has been going on." He secured nods of assent from the teens around him before dragging the tiny teen up from his seat, all bodily dragging the boy up to sit behind the driver, taking the next seat for himself to act as a buffer to Minta's loud protests the pro was recording as evidence even as he growled out replies to the complaints. By the time the bus pulled up to the stadium where their tests would take place, the whole class was wound tighter than a mechanical yo-yo. Minta had indeed not shut up, and had instead continued to dig himself a deeper hole. So as soon as the doors opened, Aizawa was barking at the others to get to the front lobby for check-in while he found someone to remove the grape from the test list. This led to more wails of protest, of course, but at least the other teens only had to hear them for a second or two before he was too far away to make out his words. Yaoyorozu and Ida took over efficiently, getting everyone off the bus and unpacking their costume cases from the storage compartments within minutes. It was as they turned to head to the building that they noticed the stairs. It seemed every other disembarking bus full of hero hopefuls was fixated on the big UA logo on the side of their transport and the distinctive uniforms Classa was wearing. It didn't take them long to descend either. A group of Shiksu students made their way over to lightly harass them. Izuku wasn't sure what to think of the tall, loud Yurashi, but Shinso seemed to immediately dislike him as he pulled Todoroki back into his chest in a possessive hug. Clear and dangerous. This seemed to make the other school's student pause, especially when Shoto gently patted his boyfriend's shoulder in an effort to calm him. As the Shiksu students stepped away to catch up with their teacher, Ketsubutsu took their chance. A boy with hair as curly as Izuku's was before he cut it all but scooped the brunette's hand up into his own, beaming at him as he gushed about UA. Instead of responding kindly though, Izuku froze. The other boy's smile was wrong, large but empty, like when his old teachers would lie to him about the reasons he was getting detention, but the kids that attacked him were not fake. Denki seemed to sense something was wrong too, gently tugging their hands apart and asking the newcomer to not touch without asking. His sunshine personality firmly in place to keep from ruffling any feathers. From there, Ida got bossy, ushering all of his classmates to the building, insisting that they get checked in as soon as possible. The electric blonde wrapped an arm around his smallest boyfriend's shoulders and guided the two of them around the Ketsubutsu crowd and into the center of the class a bunch. Izuku was obviously too busy thinking over the interactions, big brain racing at the interest and focus on the single class of first years. After a moment, he looked up into golden eyes, but announced in a voice just loud enough for his classmates to hear, "We're going to be targeted. We're younger and they know our quirks because of the sports festival. We are at a disadvantage and they all know it." There was a half-second pause from everyone as they stopped their own conversations at his announcement, and then they were all switching into work mode, talking over what they needed to do to combat the issues that had just come to light. But Denki just smiled and tucked Izuku closer into his side, content to let the green genius do the planning, taking up position as his guide dog while his mind worked in hyperspeed. The other schools might have a basic advantage, but they had brains and brawn and more determination. So even if they didn't all pass, they knew they wouldn't go down easy. The first test was utter bullshit and Izuku wanted to speak to a manager. Why, if they wanted new heroes so badly, were they culling the numbers so harshly? He was sure it had something to do with the number of undesirable quirks in attendance. He had counted several while they were in the midst of the free-for-all. Honestly, he wouldn't be surprised if he was one of the ones they assured themselves would fail. Well, the joke was on them, because the freckled boy and his villain's quirk boyfriend had made it through the madness, and now they were waiting to see if their other two paramours would do as well. Izuku had predicted that the other schools would try and break them up out of their class group, so he and Yaoyorozu had quickly devised a plan outside of their changing rooms, diving the whole of class into 2 to 3 people groups that were prepared to go with the illusion of being taken by surprise. And they did give the basic appearance of shock as Shindo showed up and literally rocked their world. But with quick clasping of the hands of assigned partners, no one ended up alone, and everyone had the perfect supporting quirks for their own favored tactics. Hitoshi had held 3 people under his influence while his smallest boyfriend ran by and gently tagged targets, and then they switched out, the blur of black and red distracting a target with hand-to-hand while his purple shadow took aim. They were some of the first into the waiting room after they handed in the borrowed electronics that had been attached to their costumes. Truthfully, they had barely had time to browse the snack table before the rest of their class started to steadily flood in. Kaminari and Todoroki showed up fairly quickly. The combination of both electricity and the water created when Shoto melted his ice was apparently as versatile as Izuku had predicted. Denki talked a mile a minute as he went over their tactics and knockouts. The 4 of them chatted with their friends near the snacks, laughing and going over the highlights of their fights, doing their best to ignore the looks they were getting from the others around them. Izuku was glad to see that all of his class, save Minda who was still who knew where with Aizawa, had made it through the first test, though Mina and Sato cut it pretty close. When the second test was announced, all of them were thankful they wouldn't be fighting the older and more experienced students again. They might not have gotten much actual rescue experience thanks to the whole USJ mess, but Aizawa had gone over theoreticals and guidelines extensively to try and make up for it, so one felt fairly confident that they wouldn't fuck up too badly. Probably. They were an overall optimistic bunch. When the buzzer sounded, they were off en masse, putting themselves forwards to help wherever they could. Uraraka in particular shining with her quirk, making rescues leagues easier. though she made sure to stick close to either Izuku or Yamomo so they could make sure everything was stable enough so she did not cause an avalanche. Izuku was putting his muscles to work, occasionally stopping to gently direct those who needed a nudge in the right direction. But for the most part he was stepping in to carry civilians who were too injured to walk to the triage station that had been set up. He did spare a half a thought or wistfulness for the force shield he had made just for such a station, before mentally sighing. The one big enough for that large of an area was way too big to just carry on him. Maybe he could put it on some sort of drone and have it come to him when he pressed a button. He got back to work, forcing his thoughts away from inventing so he wouldn't be distracted, stopping by Shadow who was holding up an unstable building with his ice while others ran in to grab their targets. He glanced between his boyfriend and the giant glacier before digging a mini water bottle from a pouch on his belt and cracking it open. He held it up to his partner's lips, letting the other boy all but chug it. Most of the water for his constructions came from the air, but the start of the ice came from his own body, and doing things that large over and over meant he was most likely starting to really feel the dehydration. After this you should focus on smaller tunnel props where you can hand-tie. Maybe try. He was cut off by a boom and the announcement of the arrival of villains. He almost rolled his eyes at the test throwing them a curveball, but quickly switched tactics. Okay, never mind. You're one of our hardest hitters. I'll cover you from the goons. Try and get the boss. With a confirming nod they raced to the thick of the fighting. Todoroki aimed straight for Gang Orca, using his fire to try and dry out his skin. Izuku watching his back to keep the massive men in matching suits away from the hero and training with the best chance of getting through the villain. The two-tone teen's first attack almost hit the pro, but a gust of wind knocked the move off course. The hero hopeful looked over to find the massive Shikzu student flying towards them. The other male's face was set into an odd expression, almost one of hate if Shadow had to guess, but he was looking at him, not the play villain on their test. It made no sense and the heterochromatic teen tried to ignore it to go back on the attack only to be blocked again. There was an infuriated growl from behind Shadow before a familiar length of dark chain snaked past him to wrap around the other student's ankle, a flicker of green electricity forcing him to lose control of his wind quirk. The hero-to-be, Hantai, trusted his partner to take care of this problem and covered him, raising an ice wall to slow the goons behind them as he stepped forwards once more to whittle down Gang Orca. Izuku for his part stomped up to the Shikzu student who had been forced to drop roughly to the ground by his weapon. He grabbed the other boy by the collar, glad he had been laid out on his ass so he was sitting. This would have been impossible for the tiny teen if he was standing. He dragged the huge boy's face close to his own, meeting his furious gaze head-on. When he spoke he made sure it was loud enough that the goons at the very least would be able to hear him. He figures they would be getting a say in how they were being graded, and Izuku didn't want either of them being marked down for some rando's bullshit. The next time you risk civilian lives just because you want to mess up another hero's fight, I will take you completely out of commission myself. I don't know what your problem is, but this is a villain situation and I will not let you get in the way of others' health and safety. He glared for a second more, trying to drive his point home, before turning to dodge a shot from the first goon to scramble over Shadow's makeshift wall. He was furious, but he knew he couldn't actively fight the hero hopeful targeting his boyfriend in that moment. It could wait until the test was over, but he wouldn't let this slide any longer than he needed to. Grudges, especially unknown ones, in a hero career could be deadly. He refused to let Shadow be in that much danger right out of the gate if he could help it. He kept an eye on the mountain of a boy as he fought, making sure he himself stayed in the corner of the threat's eyesight the whole time so he would behave. With a few called-out pointers he even got the other teen to use his wind quirk to boost Shadow's fire, effectively trapping Gang Orca for a whole minute or so until the buzzer sounded, signaling that all of the civilians had been evacuated and the test was over. As soon as the villains around them stood down, Midoria, in full Doryoku mode, stalked up to the Shikzu brat who had tried to sabotage one of his partners. "You," he growled, fairly menacingly for someone so small. "What the fuck is your problem? Shu could have gotten hurt. Why would you hinder another hero in the field?" The answer wasn't satisfactory at all, because he's too cold to be a hero. At the entrance exam his eyes were just like his father's, cold and distant and not passionate at all, and I didn't want to just let another endeavor out into the world. He cuts off as a punch slammed into the side of his face. The short greenette hadn't let go of the other boy but had managed a twist that meant more body weight and thus more power into the hit. How dare you? Shu is nothing like that piece of shit. He felt hands on his shoulder yanking him back and away from his target but kept up his tirade. You just tried to sabotage his whole career over him being a bit distant during the stressful day of the entrance exams, because he looked like his sperm donor. Newsflash, asshole, Shadow doesn't like his dad either. He's the sweetest, warmest, kindest person and I'm sick of people judging him because his dad is such a dick. He is not Endeavor. He's his own damn person, you fucking moron, I swear to go. Izuku. What? The world went quiet, a familiar comforting fog falling over his mind. He felt his body forcing itself to calm down, his breathing evening out from the nearly frantic gasping it had been when he was too enraged to try and slow it. There were voices around them, movement and blotches of black and white, and then he was coming back around in a sea of violets and stardust. Hitoshi held his face gently so that he could look him in the eyes, brushing a thumb rhythmically over freckles. "Hey there, firecracker. Are you going to stay calm or do I need to put you under again? Where's Shu? Is he okay?" The smaller teen tried to look around for their other partner, the one who had just heard an ignorant rant about him being like his abuser. His breathing was picking up again as he started to worry about his partner. But Hitoshi just kept a hold of him, keeping up the soothing motion of his thumb. "Relax, Izu. He's okay. Blondie's got him. But he's going to be upset if you get in trouble for attacking another student, so I need you to chill for a moment, okay?" A deep breath and a nod. And then his boyfriend was looking over his shoulder at whoever was holding the smallest boy's arms behind his back. "You can let him go." Once he was freed, the purple-haired brainwasher drew him into a hug. "You're pretty hot when you're angry. Did you know that?" The greenette sputtered before hunching in embarrassment when the psychic dressed as a henchman, who had been holding him back from attacking his fellow test-taker again, grumbled about them flirting. The man walked away with a few of his fellows to go speak with the other adults who were nearby, looking as if they were questioning Yurashi. Hitoshi was chuckling to himself as he let go of Izuku's face in order to snag his hand, gently pulling him further away. When the green-haired teen turned, he finally found Shadow, who was being held by a determined-looking Denki. The blonde was practically wrapped around him like an octopus, their quietest partner holding him up and looking a bit bemused at the position. When the two dressed as ninja badasses reached them, Denki finally hopped down, though he still kept an arm wrapped around Shadow's waist. His other hand reached out to grab Izuku's free hand, giving it a warm squeeze even as he gave the freckled genius a worried smile. Before he could drill him on how he was feeling, though, a racer had appeared, seemingly out of nowhere to those who weren't paying attention. The pro stayed back a few feet, giving the potentially volatile teenagers a bit of space. A raised eyebrow all he needed before the stressed greenette was spilling everything that had happened to his foster dad. Shadow was prompted soon after and supported his smallest boyfriend's statement. Eraserhead nodded to himself. "Right, I'll take care of it. You four go sit tight with the rest of the class in the waiting room." He ushered them off before slouching over to the group of adults and Shiksu students, prepared to do what he needed to make sure his kids weren't docked points for someone else's misbehavior. That wouldn't fly with him. By some miracle, a miracle named Aizawa Shouta most likely, all managed to pass. An exhausted-looking intern stood at the door to their bus and handed them their new provisional licenses as they loaded. The tired and battered teens all celebrated on the way home, save for one purple-tinted fuck who was shoved into the seat behind the driver and ignored as he pouted. Cards were passed around as everyone compared pictures, ribbing each other for weird smiles or funny hair. It was an hour before the novelty of the situation wore off enough for them to start calming down. After that, they started dropping like flies. By the end of the trip, Aizawa was stuck with a bus full of snoozing teens. It almost broke his heart to wake them when they were being so quiet. But then he remembered that the faster he got them to their dorm, the faster he could crash into his own bed. After that, it was the matter of a moment to pull out his phone and cue up the most annoying alarm sound he could find. The groans and grumbles were worth it, as he guessed they would be, and he wasted no time in shooing them off the bus and in the direction of Heights Alliance, all except for the little pervert who he kept hold of so the brat couldn't attempt to run. Who knew what kind of things an idiot would try after all? No, Minda was coming with him, straight to Nezu's office for the meeting the homeroom teacher had called, his parents most likely already waiting on them. Izuku cuddled with Shadow on the couch in the common room. Shinso and Kaminari had gone upstairs for a proper nap. But Izuku knew he would most likely be called in to talk to Nezu soon enough, most likely one of the first in class they would need, so he didn't bother with the stairs. He was curled up in green sweats, a tank top, and his ratty tie-dye hoodie. Nice and toasty thanks to his wonderful boyfriend, both of them watching Mina show off her new license to a sweetly attentive Mei. Did the inventor really care about the piece of plastic? No. Did she have the most adorable crush on the pink hero student? Very much yes. Much to no one's surprise, Izuku's phone went off fairly soon after they had all showered and settled down. The freckled boy checked the list of names in the message with a sigh. "Shadow, will you call Toshi and tell him to bring Denks? I'll get Yamomo, Jiru, and Shoji." The quiet teen agreed, pulling out his phone to wake their insomniac while the greenette wandered to the elevator to go fetch the girls. It took a moment to find the two of them. Apparently all of the girls had decided to unwind with a pamper session in Mina's room, but once he did, they were quick to come with him. They knew what this was about after all. And honestly, the whole meeting took less than an hour. The four boyfriends giving a quick overview on what had been said on the bus. Then the girls stating their experiences with sexual harassment. After that, the two with hearing quirks recounted things they had overheard but hadn't been said to them directly. And finally, Izuku went alone and told the story of when he had been outed as Quirkless. The whole time Minta bitched and complained about them taking his words too seriously, trying to talk his way out of a punishment, his parents occasionally chiming in to agree. They especially agreed with the Quirkless comments, stating that it was ridiculous that Izuku had been allowed into the school in any capacity, truly showing where their son got his biases. So with a quick report and a flourishing sign, the diminutive boy was expelled. Nezu kept his word about not tolerating any kind of discrimination. Watching his students relax when they realized he wasn't upset with them for coming forwards was saddening. But hopefully they would realize that he really was on their side and come to him more easily in the future. And he could use Minta as yet another example to the student body to show what consequences to expect if they felt like bullying each other. He was determined to make a dent in the broken society one small step at a time. The boys planned their first real date on the way back to the dorms. They had the weekend off before classes started back up, so they wanted to go celebrate together. They settled on a water park since it was still hot out during the day and none of them had ever been. While three of them headed into the kitchen, Yaoyorozu pulled Izuku aside to ask him for a favor, letting him go find food with a thankful smile when he agreed. Little did she know Jiro had asked him to do the exact same thing the week before. When he was done, he was sure they would all have a good laugh about it. The greenette settled down at the table in front of the plate he had been set, thanking Hitoshi for the sandwich with a quick peck on the cheek. They finalized their plans for the next day as Izuku texted Aizawa to make sure they could get permission to leave the campus. After dinner, they split up for an early night, drained from a long, emotionally and physically draining day. Yamada dropped the four boys off at the nearest water park, cheerfully reminding them to call him when they're ready to head back to UA. They were all dressed in casual wear, wanting to have a change of clothes just in case they decided to walk to some of the nearby shopping areas after they were done swimming. Shadow half-bullied his way to the front when they got to the ticket line, insisting that Endeavor pay for his son's first gay date. The thought of the look on the asshole's face if he ever found out was amusing enough that the other three let him swipe the fancy metal credit card without any real fuss. And then with some wristbands and a wave from the receptionist, they were in. Izuku's first thought was that the place was way bigger than he thought it would be. When he thought of a water park, he pictured a couple of slides and a big pool, maybe a hot tub or waiting area. But this particular park was gigantic. There are 6 slides of differing configurations, some sort of tube chute, a whirlpool, a surfing area. And that was just what they could see from the entrance. They quickly found the large locker rooms, slipping in with excited chatter about what they wanted to try first. Denki was buzzing about the chance to try surfing, while Izuku was curious about the working of the chute, so they decided to try the slides together first and then split into 2 groups. They switched into their swimsuits, snickering at how they all somehow managed to match theirs to their hair. Even Shadow had a pair of shirts that were half white, half red. Izuku also pulled on a loose black long-sleeve t-shirt on their way out the door. The place was busy. With school starting up that week, there were a lot of middle and high school kids making the most of their last free weekend before the return of the grind. The line for the slides was fairly long, which is why they decided to go there first. That way they could decide if it was worth the wait to do it again later or if they would spend the rest of their time having fun elsewhere. Izuku and Denki held hands the entire time, jabbering excitedly about whatever popped into their heads while their quieter boyfriends stared down anyone who looked their way too long. The people in line behind them were the worst, a group who were obviously from the same school, mixed evenly between girls and boys. Maybe a year older than them and giving off snooty vibes, they kept looking at the smaller group with something ugly in their eyes, making snide comments to each other under their breath. Shinso made sure to shift a bit so they would have a harder time seeing his shorter boyfriends and hoped they could keep their bullshit to themselves. If they ruined his first real date with all 4 of them, he would be pissed. It took a bit, but they did eventually make it up to the front of the line, about to make their way up the stairs. But unfortunately, things couldn't ever be easy for them. The poor teen stuck policing the line stopped their group with an overwhelmed air. "Hi, yes, I'm sorry, but there are no regular shirts allowed in our pools or slides. Our pumps are super sensitive to fiber buildup, so it's spandex and polyester materials only." 3 of them froze, looking uncertainly at their smallest member. Denki tugged on Izuku's hand to get his attention. "Hey, that's okay, we can go somewhere else. There was that one restaurant downtown, right?" "Hey," a voice piped up from behind them. "Are you losers going or not? We're getting tired of waiting." Hitoshi turned on them with a snarl. "Shut the fuck up. You can wait the 2 minutes it takes him to figure out what he wants to do, you assholes." One of the larger boys stepped forwards, getting in Shinso's face with a snarl of his own. But before they could really start arguing, the purple-haired teen was drawn back by a familiar hand on his arm. "Hey Toshi, it's okay. Come on, let's go down the slides and then check out the chute." Violet eyes snapped to his boyfriend, going from furious to worried in a millisecond. "You sure Zoo? We can still go somewhere else if you don't want to take your shirt off." "Yeah, come on. I want to try all of the cool things here and, well, I'd never want to break their fancy machines, right? But, what was it you said that one time? They're a part of me, so if anyone has a problem with them, then they can suck it up right. Hitoshi looked down at him with pride and awe, amazed with how far he had come in less than a year. Yeah, they can suck it up or deal with me. The sweet smile he got in return for that made his whole week. And then Izuku was turning back to the stressed attendant. Hey, can I leave the shirt with you until we're done on the slide? I'll come get it afterwards to go put up. When she agreed, the greenette quickly stepped off the offending clothing item, handing it to her and purposely ignoring the growing surprise and dawning horror on her face as he started heading up the stairs. Luckily, Denki came to the rescue, wolf whistling and racing to follow their freckled Adonis. Damn, Izu, I knew you were ripped, but look at those abs. I hope you know I'm going to be all over those if given half a chance. They made their way further up, but the two others of their group took another moment to glare at both the attendant and the rude teens behind them, daring them to speak their thoughts out loud. But eventually they did move to catch up to their two golden retrievers. The slides were fun, and if Shadow chilled the pool at the end a bit after the others got out, then no one had to know. He just hoped the rude group of older teens enjoyed the shock. From there they split up, Shinso being dragged away by Denki to go watch the blonde try and fail at the surfing pool. Izuku and Shadow stopped by the locker room to put away his shirt before heading to the weird water chute. The greenette studied the whole structure and equipment underneath it before he even went near the line. He bounced in place a bit as he described the machines and how much water pressure they must be able to generate, basing his numbers off of what little he could see through the fencing and casings. He watched as people shot through the translucent tube high above, going down the slightly sloping almost slide on small plastic sleds at speeds much faster than would normally be possible. They were given their sleds and quickly walked through how to lay back and keep their limbs intact before being dropped into the entrance of the tube one by one. Todoroki went first and had just reached the edge of the catch pool when he heard the delighted whoops of his boyfriend coming down afterward. He let a small smile across his face at the sound, waiting for Izuku to catch up before walking over to take both of their sleds back to the attendant. He then appreciated the sight of his partner giggling and dashing around in front of him, going from one side to another with a huge grin, arms locked behind him as he spun to face his doting two-tone gaze. Shoo, come see this hologram. It's adorable. We should make sure to get a picture of it before we leave. Eventually, they made it back to their other halves, fourths, all heading to the pool while lightheartedly joking about Denki's wipeouts while trying the surfing thing. The blonde made fun of himself while Izuku pumped him up for even giving it a shot. They ran into the other group of teens in the pool, sharing a mutual glare before heading to the other side so they could hang out without the toxicity poisoning their fun. The next few hours were a blur of playful splashes and laps around the park as they boys slowly tried most of the attraction, sometimes all together, sometimes in different pairs. But by lunchtime they decided they were done with the water and headed to shower off and get changed. Hitoshi pulled up the map to the small restaurant they had decided on earlier so they knew where to go. The walk wasn't terrible, only 15 minutes, and even with the full body workout that swimming had already given them, they all still had plenty of energy. Well, they all managed to make it at least. By the time they got to their destination, Hitoshi was flagging a bit, forced into confessing his issues sleeping the night before by a worried Shadow. Turns out it's hard to drift off when you're nervous about a date. That admission earned him an enamored peck on the cheek from Denki while Izuku cooed from off to the side. Lunch was delicious. They ordered a good mix of options and passed their plates around until everyone got a taste. The hamburger was definitely the crowd favorite, Izuku ordering a second one to cut into fourths so his partners could really enjoy it. After they had paid, they wandered around the strip mall they were in while they waited for Yamada to pick them up, Shadow buying each of them random things here and there in an effort to surprise them. By the time Mike pulled up to them with the SUV, Izuku was carrying around a walrus plushie that was bigger than he was. Denki had a new fidget puzzle that was stealing all of his attention, and Hitoshi was planning where exactly he was going to hang up his new hammock in his dorm room. Shadow was, of course, looking fairly pleased with himself as he helped shove a walrus tail into the car before he himself squeezed into what was left of the seat. All in all, he figured it was a successful enough date. Izuku was almost skipping as he headed to the cafe. He had helped Yaoyorozu and Jiru with their request, a magical mutual confession contrived by a scheming greenette. It was getting late, but the cafe was technically on the way back to Yue-ish, and he thought that Denki might like something sweet. And of course Hitoshi always appreciated a good cup of coffee. He hummed as he made a list of what to order in his head, texting Aizawa what his slight holdup was and asking if the two heroes wanted anything while he was there. He smiled at the lighthearted grumbling from his foster father and the request for coffee. He and Hitoshi really were similar. He was just around the corner from the little shop when a shadow moving in the corner of his eye startled him. He didn't get to do more than flinch before there was a stinging in his neck and everything went black, his phone hitting the sidewalk and sending shattered bits all over in front of his eyes as they slid closed involuntary. His last fuzzy thought was that he could have sworn he had buffed the old thing enough for it not to do that. Hitoshi was cuddled against Shadow in his beanbag, a movie playing on his laptop in front of him. He knew Izuku was due to be back soon enough and had invited the Greenette to join them when he got back, though he knew he was more likely to join Denki and his friends in their study session downstairs. But for now he was happy and warm, his boyfriend heating up the space under their blanket with his quirk. Honestly, if he kept that up, Hitoshi didn't know how long he would be able to stay awake. Shoto, for his part, was absolutely fixated on the movie they had chosen, one about a girl and a boy who worked in a violin shop. He was just dozing off to the sound of bittersweet teen angst when there was a knock on his door. He grumbled to himself before stumbling to his feet and sleepily making his way over to see who it was. Finding Aizawa standing in the hallway was unusual, but finding the man looking worried and tailed by Denki and Yaoyorozu was even more so. And when he started grilling the purple-haired teen about their boyfriend, the picture of something really being wrong was complete. "Is Izuku with you?" "No." "Why?" The three people outside of his door looked even more stressed at that response, sharing a glance between themselves. Hitoshi's heart sinks at the familiar look of smothered panic. Shoto joined him in the doorway, steadfast and ready to do what was needed of him as usual. "He texted me about an hour ago asking what I wanted from that cafe you guys like so much. But he never replied to my text and I called the cafe and he never showed up there. His phone is either dead or turned off and is no longer sending out any kind of GPS signal, which means the battery has likely been removed." All four of the teens present worked through the situation as it was talked through, all coming to the same horrible conclusion. Aizawa pulled his phone from his pocket with his traditional glare not glare worried look. "I'll call Nezu and get Tsukachi on the lookout. You four alert the others in the class and have everyone gather in the common room for a head count and then stay there. If Izuku makes it back, call me immediately." With that, the man spun around and stormed back to the stairs, phone already up to his ear. Yaoyorozu snapped into class president mode fairly quickly, pulling her phone from her pocket and opening up the class group chat, the one Izuku had upgraded the coding for on one sleepless night about a month before. With a few swiped on her thumb and her mod credentials, the dorms started ringing with the sound of their custom alarm. The command to head to the common room for a head count coming through less than a second later. The sound of movement followed the slow decrease of alarms as people sent in their acknowledgement. The stairwell soon sent back echoes of hurrying feet on concrete steps. Denki led their own group's way down while Hitoshi let Shoto guide him with a hand on his elbow while he typed and sent a text to both Hatsune. Knowing they would both show up as soon as they were able and wanting the stability the fiery woman always seemed to bring to chaos. He ignored his phone for a moment as he tuned in to make sure the rest of his class was present and accounted for, but responded to the two women who were now blowing up his phone as he was dragged to a couch and forced to sit while two of his boyfriends cuddled close in the name of comforting each other through their worry. Hatsune-sen confirmed she was on the way, and Shinso shoved his phone in his hoodie pocket so he could pull a lightly shaking Denki closer with a murmur of reassurance. Green eyes cracked open slowly, blinking in confusion, when he didn't recognize his surroundings. Izuku tried to roll over so he could sit up, only to find that his hands were bound behind him and secured to a radiator. After a moment of awkward wiggling, he managed to slide into a better position and used the radiator to pull himself into a hunched sitting position. It wasn't comfortable, but at least this way he could see past the arm of the couch that was half blocking the rest of the room from view. It seemed like a regular living room. Bland creams and whites, basic amenities. Nothing really stood out save for the few beer bottles left sitting on random surfaces. Not enough to say the place was dirty, more like someone had guests over and hadn't tidied up yet. He could just barely see out the window caddy corner from him. It looked like he was a floor or two up from the ground, the sun well since gone judging by how dark the sky was. And if he stretched his neck and shoulders, he caught sight of something that made him freeze as various things clicked. Because there, just inside of his position through the window, he could see a very familiar maple tree. Just as his mind caught up to said trees, meaning the door across the room open. "Tsukachi, I need to put a bolo out on one of my kids. He went missing on his way back to campus." "Which kid?" "Izuku." "Aw shit, that had better be, and I forgot to tell you I have him kind of oh shit Naomasa." "No, it's just, Bakugo Katsuki also went missing about 2 weeks ago. They had history right." "I swear to God. Why weren't we alerted?" "Because you're not his guardian and he doesn't go to school there anymore. We thought it was a runaway case, but maybe not. Or maybe Bakugo is the one who grabbed Midoria." Shoto let free his necessary stream of curses as he finished his run back to the teachers' dorms. Already the whole campus was going on lockdown as Nezu mobilized the teachers to count their students and gather everyone into their safe places. But Aizawa wouldn't worry about that, leaving his and Hisashi's class to Cementos. The two men were going to hit the streets to find their missing child. "Dunno, either way, have the police keep an eye out for anything out of place." "Will do." They hung up as they both broke off to gather what was needed for the massive search that was about to kick off. The first two people to walk into the apartment were unfamiliar, and a small bit of hope swelled in Izuku's heart before almost immediately being crushed by the voices that spoke up behind them. His mother was practically cooing at Katsuki as they entered the small living room. It took them a moment, but eventually one of the strangers noticed he was awake, pointing him out with a grumble before heading into the connected kitchen. From the clink of bottles, Izuku determined the man was one of the reasons for all of the beer trash scattered around. Oh, Izuku, you woke up both too late and too early. The dosages for the drugs are so weird for the Quirkless. I guess we really did get it wrong. You were supposed to wake up 2 hours ago. We could dose you again, I suppose, but that might be a waste. Inko hummed to herself for a moment as her son stared at her blankly, only to flinch as his once best friend crouched down beside him. He hadn't even seen the blonde approach. Oi Deku, how's it been living my dream? You ain't going well. Kachan. A backhand to the face stopped the freckled boy from trying to talk his way through the situation. Don't you Kachan me, you little freak. Now Katsuki, don't leave any marks. My boss always wants as little extra work as possible. Inko was already wandering away to one of the doors off to the side, leaving her son with his leering abuser. She opened the door and poked her head in. Kurai honey, we're back. I brought you the burger you wanted. Also Izuku woke up. There was a grumbling response. No. Okay. Yes, we will head out in about an hour or so, darling. Okay. She wandered back into the room. Okay. He'll be out in a minute, Makiru-san. Go ahead and put the food down on the table and you three eat. I'm going to wait for Kurai. The man next to her grunted and walked over to the table with the other stranger was already sitting. They traded food for a second beer and started settling in to eat. Bakugo stood, giving a sharp kick to Izuku's leg on his way past to find his own dinner. The greenettes were left staring at each other at the three others in the room focused on stuffing their faces. Mom, why am I here? The woman sighed. My lawyer has informed me that there's most likely no way I am winning the court case. So you're here because I didn't want to let them win. You're my son. You get to leave on my terms. No one else's. By the end she was full on glaring at him. Green eyes so like his own, completely filled with rage and hate. He shrank back, sensing that asking her anything else at that moment would be a very bad idea. No matter what she said about her mysterious boss not wanting marks, they didn't say anything else before his mother's knew. No, not new. Izuku had been seeing that tree during their video calls for at least a year. They didn't say anything else before his mother's boyfriend came out of what Izuku assumed was a bedroom. The blonde man glowered at him before barking an order at Inko to go set out his dinner. As she scurried off to do as he said, Kurai stepped up to the quirkless teen bound in his apartment. Little faggot, not so high and mighty now are we? No, now you're back in your place and about to be very useful for the first time in your life. If you know what's good for you, you won't fight it. Submit or I'll have one of my friends over there break something important. Or maybe I'll let that Bakugo brat have his way. He's still really angry about his expulsion, you know. I'm sure he would love to maim you even more than he already has. With a sickening smile at the thought, the man wandered off to go eat, leaving his captive to simmer in the knowledge that he was very much in danger even with the presence of the woman who birthed him. Izuku grunted as he was hauled up and tossed carelessly into what he assumed was the floor of a car. The two accomplices had gagged him before releasing the extra length of chain from the radiator. He was then shoved into a large duffel bag and carried off. He listened as others climbed into the vehicle, the shift of the struts and the slamming doors giving him the idea that everyone from the apartment was coming along. The hump in the floorboard was digging into his belly, made worse when someone decided to use his back as a footrest, pressing down heavily and occasionally shifting to add more force one way or the other. The greenette tried to wiggle a bit to ease the pain off his diaphragm, only for said feet to slam down harshly, Katsuki growling at him to stay still. The captive felt it when they made it to the highway, the shift in speed causing him to slide slightly before Katsuki and whoever was in the other seat steadied him by pressing him further into the floor. He swallowed around his gag as something in his ankle shifted under their foot. They drove for a while, long enough that he was really starting to have trouble breathing with his blocked airway and compressed lungs. He wasn't sure on the time frame, but if he had to guess he would say they were probably in the next city over from Musutafo. When the car stopped and everyone started to vacate the vehicle, the teen in the bag felt his stress levels ratchet up a bit. Sure, he was positive he had at least one bruise from their little drive, but he would prefer that passive torment to whatever this group had in store for him. He listened as the crunch of gravel shifted to the slap of shoes on concrete, quickly followed by the slam of a heavy door. He was passed back and forth occasionally, presumably when the men got too tired, and the motion made it hard to tell if he was being handed off or if they were turning corners. But he was sure of at least one elevator ride, so there was that at least. There was a pause before he heard the zipper being pulled above him, the sudden light blinding him as he was dumped to the floor, then hoisted up and into a padded chair. They freed his hands from their cuffs before binding his wrists again, this time with leather straps attached to the armrests. When his vision adjusted, he was greeted to the sight of his mother, abuser, and the rando Inko picked up. The other two men were already disappearing out the door. Green eyes glared at his captors from over his gag. If he was able, he would have asked where they were. Coincidences be damned. But, perhaps luckily, they had taken that option from him. Instead, he had to make do with looking around the room they were in while Kurai called their boss to let them know they were here. There wasn't much to look at from the angle his chair was facing. The walls and floor were both pristine white, looking freshly scrubbed, which would explain the bleach smell. And when he turned his neck as far as he dared without risking drawing attention, he could just see the corner of some sort of metal table reflecting the glow of a computer screen. There might have been a stool over there too, but he wasn't sure. Unfortunately, his goodish luck wouldn't last. Bakugo eventually got bored of standing with the adults as they talked over mundane things like where they would go for lunch that day. The blonde sauntered over with his familiar disgruntled frown, glaring down his prey as he approached. "Hey, Deku, you never did answer my question earlier." He stood leering over the other boy, leaning down with his hands shoved in his pockets to bring their faces closer. "But I guess it doesn't really matter. You're whacking up from your little UA daydream. Best go ahead and forget all that bullshit they were spouting about equality, cause the rest of the world's gonna give you a reality check, bitch." He reached up to lightly slap a freckled cheek. "Maybe I'll even get to help with that if you try and fight it. It'd be just like old times. Right, Deku?" Unable to reply, all the smaller teen could do was glare, Pithallo almost glowing with his anger as the cochineal above gloated, holding the fact that Izuku was screwed over the scarred boy's head like it was something to be proud of. And for Bakugo it was. After all, the explosive blonde's entire life had been leading up to this, every taunt, shove, blast, and burn. All of it culminated in Katsuki playing a part in stealing Izuku away from the family he had made for himself. But before Bakugo could continue taunting his one-time friend, the door to the room opened again, admitting 3 men in beaked masks. The one in the lead wearing a large rough coat and gaining respectful bows from Inko and Kurai, and even a quiet nod from Bakugo. "Sir," Kurai addressed the man who was obviously the boss. "We brought you the no, just as you asked. MHHHH, so it seems. Let me see its feet." He gestured to the one who was closest in order. Katsuki rolled his eyes but complied, crouching down and yanking Izuku's shoes and socks off roughly. The boss crouched down to get a better look, though he did stay fairly far back. Izuku wished he would get in range of a kick so he would know how the boy felt about the situation. Double pinky joined on each foot. "Perfect. With this we can hopefully speed up our research by months at the least." He gestured to Kurai. "Get samples. As many as possible. We need to build up our sample pool to get the machine started analyzing as soon as possible." The large blonde grinned and nodded amicably. "Yes, sir. Inko, start setting up the receptacles and I'll get the IV hooked up. We can take skin samples while the vials fill." The tiny green woman nodded in agreement before heading around her son's chair and rolling the stainless steel cart around to the side so they could better reach the tools there. Izuku paled at the sight of all of the medical paraphernalia, though he did only see one readied scalpel, so at least he wouldn't be getting dissected. He hoped. He couldn't move enough to keep his mother's boyfriend from stabbing the hollow tube into his arm, setting up some sort of line to a small machine on the cart that Inko had been loading with tubes she had printing off tags for. "Okay, the machine is full. That's 30 vials for the first round. These are the 10 milliliters vials. So that's another 7 sets after this before he will need to be overhauled. Not counting any bleeding he might do as we take skin samples. To be safe, I'd do the overhaul after the 5th round." The man, who still hadn't been introduced, nodded in understanding before stepping back a bit, glaring at the blood visibly starting to be pulled through the tube with distaste. Bakugo had also backed off, making an effort to stay out of the way by leaning against the wall, looking on with a bored type of passing interest. Kurai and Inko worked in tandem. Inko handing off tools and slides as requested, and Kurai starting in with the scalpel, scraping thin layers of skin off of Izuku's arms. It burned like the world's worst paper cut, and the teen flinched every time he came back for more. And the whole time his mother chatted with her boyfriend like what was happening was an everyday occurrence, talking about how their old apartment was probably about to be raided and how they were glad they had brought the last bags of their stuff on this trip so all the heroes would get was their old furniture. And then moving on to how living in this complex would be so much better than an hour commute one way. From there they fluttered between topics like dinner and how they should set up their entertainment system, paying absolutely no attention to the pain they were inflicting on the person who was supposed to be their kid. The one positive in Izuku's eyes was that they were efficient despite the chatter. Inko was always ready with whatever Kurai or the machine needed whenever they needed it. It was at about 3 refills of the machine and that Izuku started losing the plot. His head was spinning as the loss of blood hit him hard and fast. Unable to make out all of the words flying around him as he had to focus his woozy brain to just keep himself from puking from his dizziness. He was sure that wouldn't end well with the gag still in place. His vision was totally blacked out at the edges when things around him changed enough for him to really notice. The boss had stepped forwards, stripping off one of his white gloves. After another minute or so of back and forth with the 2 nurses, the IV tube was removed, no care really taken to not damage the vein. And the sudden sharp pain brought the green teen a bit back more into himself. just in time to have a hand latch itself onto his face. He was going to try to shake it off, but he never got the chance as his world was suddenly nothing but agony. It was a worse pain than everything he had felt in his life put together. The burns, breaks, and bruises of the past were nothing compared to every molecule of his body being ripped apart, shuffled around, and put back together. He came back into himself after a moment, aware enough to tell how badly he was shaking and crying. Feeling off, unsure what had just happened. Thankfully, trusty old Kachan was there to bring the other boy up to speed. How was it, Deku? Being completely remade. I'm told by some of the lackeys here it's painful. He grinned down at the smaller teen maliciously. He probably would have continued taunting him, but the boss waved him back. Enough, Bakuhatsu. We have no need for you here. Why don't you go run down and spar with some of the men? They could always use some fresh meat to go against. The blonde looked like he would much rather stay and watch his favorite target suffer, but he backed off without a fight. Nodding in respect and with a quick, sure-thing overhaul, he was gone. Overhaul took out a spray bottle of disinfectant and sprayed his hand down. Izuku flinching back as expected the substance to burn in the open wounds on his arms, only to realize his arms didn't really hurt. He looked down in confusion to find that all of the places where skin samples had been taken were gone, along with the IV wound. He blinked in confusion before his racing brain figured out what exactly had just happened. He had been remade, overhauled, so his wounds were gone, though if he looked closely he could see a tiny bit of discoloration, probably where the new skin hadn't been subjected to sunlight. He wondered how many times this had to happen to him before he scarred. He had a sinking feeling he was going to find out. With a nod from their boss, the two nurses started the process over again, taking and taking until Izuku literally had nothing else to give. This time he knew to fear the pale hand as it reached for him, already crying from fear as he leaned away in a futile attempt to get away. The pain was the same overwhelming tidal wave as before, nothing having changed that he could tell. And he knew if he was to be subjected to that agony often he would break sooner rather than later. He sobbed as he was once more hooked to an IV. His only solace was Overhaul announcing that this would be the last round because he had a meeting to get to that morning, and that was all the time they would have. The last round meant at least one more round of being ripped apart, and Izuku shuddered at the thought, trying and failing to tug free of his restraints. Unfortunately, he wasn't to be so lucky. He was stuck. He had no way free of this mess. His only hope were the heroes who had no idea where he was. He prayed they would find some sort of trail or clue or something. Anything. Because he wasn't sure how long he would be able to last in this cold place. It took a minute for Izuku to come back to himself after being overhauled for the last time that night. By the time he was fully aware of what was going on around him, he was already up with his arms once more bound behind him and being literally dragged down a hallway by the two goons from earlier. It took him a few seconds longer to manage getting his feet under him so he could stumble forwards and take some of the pressure of his body weight off of his shoulders. They turned a corner onto a dead-end hallway where two other men were obviously standing guard at the only door. When they verified something with Izuku's escort and confirmed with someone over a walkie-talkie he was allowed through the door. Well, it was more like he was punted through the door with a barked order to behave. And then the door slammed shut and Izuku was alone, save for the fact that he was indeed not alone. A tiny face was peeking out at him from behind a bed surrounded by piles of plushies and toys. Why was he in a room with a kid? Why was there a kid here of all places? Why? He slowly sat up from where he had landed, crossing his legs and making no move to go nearer the obviously spooked little critter in the corner. He wasn't able to make out much of their features since they were still half hidden, but he could tell their hair was white and that they had a single tiny little horn on one side of their forehead. He thought their eyes might be red, but he couldn't really tell from that angle. He wished he could try to talk to them, or even just talk to himself to help calm his own racing heart. But unfortunately, the assholes who threw him in here hadn't bothered removing the gag, so he was stuck, arms behind his back, and unable to help himself. He sighed before deciding on his next move. He eased backwards bit by bit, slowly giving his little cellmate more room until his back hit a wall. The greenette then did his best to make himself comfortable, leaning back in the best way he could find and letting his eyes slip closed as his head thunked back against the brickwork. He sighed in exhaustion, feeling phantom fire race through his veins at the mere thought of what he had gone through that night. He did his best to stay unthreatening while also trying to rest, knowing his luck something else would happen far too soon, so he needed to recover as much as he could before he was once again thrown off the deep end. It was a few minutes before he heard a small shuffle, and a few minutes more before the kid unfroze from the fear of having made a noise. Izuku played with the idea of peeking to see how far they had moved, before his brain was distracted as the sudden cramping of his trapezius almost yanked his head to the left as the muscles clenched in protest from the weird position he had been in several times that day. He wasn't able to stop the quiet gasp of surprised pain, and he immediately sat forwards a bit to see if a different position would help. It didn't. Not really. It probably wouldn't until he was able to get his arms out from behind his back. A whine slipped through as he slowly tilted his head back to the right as far as he could, trying to ease the muscle out of its tantrum. You. His eyes flew open in surprise at hearing the voice. A little girl was kneeling a few feet away from him, looking absolutely terrified, but also strangely determined. He forced down his instinctual flinch at being snuck up on, staying as still as he could with the rhythmic spasming of his shoulder. He really didn't want to spook her if he could help it. Instead, he waited patiently to see what she would say or do with her newfound brazenness. It took her a moment, but she did regain herself once more, pressing in and scooting a foot closer. Are you hurt, mister? Well, he wasn't really hurt so much as hurting, but Izuku couldn't really explain that nuance to the girl with the gag in the way. Besides, she couldn't have been older than 7, so a simpler answer would be better either way. He did his best to nod. Sure, it looked a little odd with the way his neck was all tensed up. Luckily, he did seem to get the answer across since she nodded back before asking, Can I help? He really didn't have an answer for that. She might be able to help him brace so he could slip his butt and legs through the loop of his arms. If he was wearing regular handcuffs, it wouldn't be a problem. He was flexible enough he could slip his arms around easily. But these cuffs were some strange form he had never seen before. Maybe foreign-made or some sort of quirk-proof thing they just had on hand. Who knows? But the issue was that they had no chain. Just 2 thick hinged metal cuffs welded to each other in a way that kept his wrists crossed, without the ability to separate his wrists or move his shoulders into a different position. He wasn't really able to do it himself. But maybe with a little outside pressure they could manage it. But that was still just a maybe, and he still couldn't really explain it with his inability to speak, so he did all he could and gave a lopsided shrug. May I? Would you let me take the thingy off your face, mister? Now that would be helpful. He quickly nodded, wincing a bit at a particularly sharp cramp in response to the movement, but too excited about being free of the nasty rag in his mouth to really care too much. The tiny thing was brave enough to actually scooch forwards on her knees, slowly reaching up to tug the gag free. The green teen sighed in relief, working his sore jaw and feeling out the extent of the raw skin at the corners of his mouth and across his cheeks. He coughed to clear his throat, but still sounded absolutely awful when he spoke, probably from all of the screaming he had done that night. Thank you. I'm Izuku. What's your name? I'm Eri. Hi, Eri. I'd say it was nice to meet you, but I'd rather we both be anywhere but here. His joke was greeted with a blank stare. He paused a second before moving on awkwardly. Oh well, if I try to slide my arms around to the front, do you think you could help me push them? She gave him a slow nod and he beamed at her. Awesome, here we go. He scrambled up to kneel on his knees, leaning forwards as best he could without falling on his face, and started trying to slide the loop of his arms around his hips. After a moment of watching him wiggle his way about 2 inches further than he could go comfortably, Eri really did step in to help. She grabbed his wrists where they were cuffed and threw her body weight into helping him get them around. After a moment of struggle, they slipped the last of the way over his butt and ended up behind his knees. Oh, thank you, Eri, he said as cheerfully as he could. Once she had scampered off back towards the bed, he flopped back onto his bum and slid his feet through one by one. A sigh of relief left him as he was able to move his arms around a bit more. He immediately started stretching out his poor shoulder, easing the cramp as best as possible until it was no longer demanding so much attention. That feels so much better. Thank you again. He smiled at the tiny little thing watching him from across the small room. She nodded shyly before blinking and tilting her head, obviously curious. They've never brought another kid here before. Well, except for the ones that joined the Shy Hasami. What now? My grandpa's group. They're a Yakuza family. Kai took over when grandpa got sick. He's been trying to help me with my curse. Is that why you're here too? Are you also cursed? She looked a bit scared at that last question, but also oddly hopeful. He wasn't quite sure what she was talking about, but he had a feeling he was going to have to explain away a lot of the lies she had been fed while she had been here. I don't think so. And most likely you are cursed either, Eri. She adamantly shook her head. No, I'm cursed. I touched my daddy and he disappeared. When my curse starts glowing, I hurt people. Her red eyes teared up as she remembered what had to have been a very traumatic thing. But Izuku frowned thoughtfully. That doesn't sound like a curse to me. It sounds more like a quirk, Eri. Grandpa called it a quirk, but Kai said he's been helping me. The greenette felt his heart clenched in sympathy. The confusion and pain in the child's voice was a bit too familiar, and hearing it from someone so small made it all so much worse. Eri. He kept his voice quiet but firm, trying to channel Mia and the Amezawas and the way they always sound when they explain things to Hitoshi and him. Kai is overhaul? Yes. Well, from what I've seen of him, I can pretty easily tell he's a meanie head and a liar. So, if we take that into account, then we can say you aren't actually cursed. He probably needs you for something just like he needs me. Izuku paused as that last thought really hit him. He prayed Eri wasn't going through the same things he had just dealt with, but the visible bandaging told him that was an unrealistic dream. He took a deep breath. Look, quirks aren't inherently bad. They can be used for bad things though. Look at Kai's quirk. He could use it for so many good things. He could overhaul buildings and other things that are broken and help save people's homes. Or he could use it in rescue to help get big rubble off of people who are trapped. But what does he do with it instead? He uses it to hurt people. If anyone has a quirk that could be considered a curse, it's a villain who only uses his quirk to hurt others. Like Kai. Yasuri, you're not the one who's cursed. Overhaul is. He jumped as the little girl burst into tears, panicking that he had taken things too far. After a moment, he shuffled forwards on his knees and slowly looped his arms around her tiny frame in the best hug he could manage, relaxing a bit when she all but latched onto him in return. She sputtered into his hoodie. I never wanted to hurt anyone. He could practically hear his heart shatter. I know. You're a good person, Eri. I'm so sorry no one has tried to help you before. He comforted her as she cried herself out, and ended up curled in his lap, fast asleep. He gently used his sleeve to wipe down her face before hoisting her up and into the bed. At first he tried to settle her in by herself, but she wouldn't let go of his shirt. He didn't want to wake her up and could take the shirt off with the cuffs on, so with a huff he gave in, settling in with her curled against his chest. He slipped his hearing aids free from his ears, not really wanting to dull his senses but knowing he would need to preserve the batteries for as long as possible, slipping them under the pillow so they were out of view. It was fairly easy to drift off after the night he had just been through. His arms wrapped around Eri protectively. He prayed his heroes would find them soon. Not for his sake, but for this little girl who had obviously been through far too much. Shouta Aizawa was pissed. Someone had taken his kid. Izuku was gone. Hitoshi was panicking and being held by his remaining partners as they tried to calm him. Hizashi was running around gathering a team of heroes to help track down their missing child. And Mia was on a warpath hacking their cell service to get the records of Izuku's last movements a few days faster. Her daughter watched over her shoulder with a white-knuckled grip in the back of the woman's chair. Shouta was watching over Nezu's shoulder as the rat scanned through local surveillance feeds for the third time. Unfortunately, Izuku seemed to disappear in between one camera's view and the next, so the rat had switched to looking for anyone who seemed suspicious or out of place. Unfortunately, the mammal had managed to miss their first clue on the first few rounds of watch-throughs, but this time Aizawa caught it. A flash of blonde hair and a vaguely familiarish face, one he had only seen once. In a report, a file he had on his desk in the lounge ready for Izuku's upcoming court case. Nezu, there. He pointed and the principal quickly zoomed in to check on what the underground hero had seen. Both of them confirmed that yes, that was Meishu Kurai, and he was with two other men, one of which was carrying a large bag of some sort. The rat was on the phone immediately following the men on the cameras as far as he could. He did eventually lose them, but they had a general idea of direction, and a handy address on file that just so happened to be in that area. Tsukachi had a team on the way as soon as he had the apartment number, promising to call them as soon as he had news. But Shouta couldn't just wait. He told his husband to watch the kids and launched himself out the window before racing to the car. He would be there when they busted down the door and no one would stop him. No one would dare. He made it to the complex just as the police knocked on the door, demanding entrance. After a moment or two of no response and a second warning call, they brought forth the battering ram. The crunch of breaking wood and snapping hinges was satisfying, and Aizawa held himself back for as long as possible before following the officers into the apartment. He was ready to find his kid, bring him home to their weird little family, and smother him in good food and cuddle time. Except, Izuku wasn't there. Nothing was in the apartment except the basic furniture that came with the rental and some moldy leftovers in the fridge. Shouta's heart dropped to his feet with the realization that Izuku just wasn't there. They were too late. Hitoshi curled up tighter against Denki. He hadn't unwound from his tight ball of misery since Eraserhead had called to let Hizashi know that Izuku was no longer at the apartment. The blonde had been forced to carry his son to the car, allowing the other three distraught teens to come home with them in the name of watching over them so they didn't do something stupid. He had settled them on the floor in front of the TV, a pile of blankets thrown at them so they could burrow as needed, and a coffee table of tea and snacks at arm's reach. He and Mia then retreated up to the office to help with the search remotely. The kids were left alone to wallow in worry and field frantic texts from their friends. Hitoshi and Mei were definitely taking this situation the hardest, understandable with how soon after Hitoshi's own kidnapping it was. But Mei hadn't let go of Hitoshi's hand since they got in the door, holding it close to her chest like it was her only lifeline. The purple-themed teen was pale and shaking, obviously stuck in worst-case scenarios and flashbacks to his own recent experience. Denki and Shouto did their best to distract the two of them and brace up their shaky mental space. The blonde kept a steady stream of fluffy feel-good media on the screen, and the elemental plying the others with snacks and warm hugs and any other thing the others had ever done for him that made him feel better. They all waited in tense semi-silence for any news on their freckled genius, praying he would come back to them hale and whole. Aizawa was on the phone with Nezu and Mia, the man waiting while the two hacked into the cameras for the apartment complex. He prayed there would be a clue or a sighting or something. The thought that he had failed his kids once again was devastating enough without adding onto it with the fact that they now had no idea where his smallest child had been taken. His phone ringing felt like a death knell, but the chance it could be someone with a clue was his only real hope. And thank gods the hope was fanned. Mia was speaking 100 miles a minute, letting him know that they had gotten a quick glance at a car they believed Izuku had been taken to. A bolo pinged across the hero alerts on his phone, giving him a more understandable description than the slew of too fast words coming across his speaker. He felt the flicker of determination to find his kid flare once more as he ran over to Tsukachi in the name of making sure the man had this update as soon as possible. Izuku hissed as he was yanked forwards by his bound wrists. The guards were irritated when they opened the door and saw that he had slipped his arms around, but seemed content to just bully him around a bit in retaliation, probably too lazy to recuff him properly. But that wasn't the part the Greenette was focusing on at that moment. No, his worry was centered on the fact that they had dragged both of their cell's occupants out into the hallway. He had tried to protest, demanding that they leave Eri alone, but a harsh blow to the jaw let him know they wouldn't be listening to him. They were both dragged through the labyrinthine white halls. Izuku thought they were going in the same general direction as the room where he had been handed over to overhaul the night before and felt sick at the thought of what was to come. When he saw the two chairs as they entered the room, he decided he couldn't stand letting this happen without a fight. He yanked down and towards the man who was holding his thumb, breaking free of his grip and spinning on his heel to land a solid kick in the grunt's gut. Dodging the other guard, he dove for Eri, intent on scooping her up to try and make a run for it. A sharp sting in his shoulder preluded the burn of electrocution, sending him to the floor about a foot short of his goal. He cursed at his own favorite disarming technique being used against him. The taser came loose as he hit the ground, and Izuku struggled back up to his feet once again, reaching for the child that needed his help. He could already hear more people pounding down the hall, attracted to the sound of their scuffle. With another quiet curse, he managed to dodge another swiping hand and grabbed the tiny thing that was trembling in fear, scooping her up as securely as he could with his bound hands and spinning on his heel to make a run for it. He staggered as a punch landed squarely against his cheekbone, the force sending him a step sideways before he managed to plant his feet and start his sprint. He dodged the second man and made it to the door fairly easily, but unfortunately he was too late. As he passed through what should have been their portal to freedom, a hand latched itself around his arm, and his world disappeared in a haze of fire and ice. By the time he was able to see again, he was halfway strapped to a chair, slumped and stunned, with Overhaul standing over him looking furious. "How dare you?" the man hissed as he glared. "You're a vital component to getting my dream realized faster. You're not to leave until I say." Izuku glowered. "I'm not a component, I'm a person. And Eri isn't a component or whatever either. How dare you treat people like they're nothing but objects?" He was going to continue on his rant, but a hand lashing out to once more latch around his throat and jaw cut him off, forcing him to look up into the eyes of a madman. "Shut up. You are mine to use as needed to rid this world of its mess of curses. And that girl is the center of everything. She's the reason we can even hope to succeed in our mission. So you are going to sit back and give us what we need." Izuku was done, tired of listening to asshole after asshole. He worked up as much liquid as he could and spit at the man looking down on him for his quirk status, the projectile landing solidly on Overhaul's cheek. The villain yelped and let go of the teen to scrub at his face with a hiss and a litany of curses. His goons jumped into action as their boss devolved into an absolute fit. One of them pulled out a bottle of antibacterial soap as another found an unopened bottle of water in a cabinet off to the side. They handed them off to Overhaul and watched pensively as the man scrubbed madly at his face with a handkerchief. Once the skin was rubbed raw, the manic attention turned back to the captive Greenette, and Izuku realized exactly how badly he had just messed up. He had never seen the level of downright hatred and sickening lunacy at this close a range before, and now he would suffer for his choices. The next however long it was would be a blur in his memory. Overhaul used his quirk over and over, waiting just long enough for the boy to regain a modicum of awareness before disassembling him again, and again, and again. Izuku didn't even have a chance to count how many times he was overhauled, brain too scattered by pain and overstimulation to be able to think. His tormentor probably would have kept going, but the door opening once again seemed to pull him out of his spiral. Turning to see who was interrupting him, the two nurses he had hired walked in, greeting their boss passively and ignoring the sobbing teen that they had delivered into the hands of a psychopath. Overhaul visibly pulled himself together, scrubbing down his hands with sanitizer and taking a few breaths before fully settling and starting to bark out orders. Kirai was assigned the boy while Inko was told to take care of Eri, both of them hopping to as soon as they were told what was expected of them. Izuku didn't have the energy to try and wiggle away from the needles and scalpel, too rattled to even fully feel the sting and burn of the samples being taken. He couldn't even bring himself to look over at Eri, ashamed that he had failed to save her and that he was so pathetic as to give up so soon. He spent the rest of the day, when he wasn't lost in the overwhelming pain of his molecules being ripped apart, feeling like a failure of a hero. and praying that the real heroes would find them soon. It had been a whole day since Izuku disappeared. His boyfriends and family had spent the time in panic. Hazashi worked with Nezu and UASPR department to figure out exactly what they needed to say and what they could keep private. Me and Mei were working on trackers for every UA student to start carrying, since apparently they were all in danger all of the time. The boys were running interference with their classmates and friends and trying to hold each other together. And Shouto was doing the rounds of the underground, looking for any clue as to his son's whereabouts. But none of them were the ones who brought forth the next breakthrough. Instead, it was the bolo in the small blue car they had seen leaving the apartment complex at the exact time they lost track of Kirai and Inko. And the hit came from an unexpected source. Sir Night-Eye called the detective to confirm the description of the vehicle. Sir had found out where it had gone and the answer wasn't good. The Foresight hero called a meeting with both the UA heroes that could be spared and a slew of others he thought they would need. And when Shouta and Hazashi walked into the conference room at the man's agency, they were torn between relief that they would have so much help in rescuing their kid, and fear that so many hands were already assumed to be needed. The fear increased when Night-Eye started reading them in on the investigation that had just taken a sharp turn. The information-based hero had been monitoring a recent uptick in Yakuza activity in the area, tracing it back to one group, the Shei Hasekai. The gang had their hands in the suddenly re-expanding trigger market, and the strange quirk-binding bullets that had started showing up a few months earlier. So the SIT Night-Eye agency had decided to start hunting down every lead they could in order to make a plan of demolition. That was until 2 nights before, when a bolo had pinged in their system to march a car they had seen come and go from a small building associated with the Shei Hasekai. The car was registered under one Meishu Kirai. Once all of the facts were laid out, Sir had asked the teachers in attendance why Izuku might have been taken. Unfortunately, no one had a solid answer besides Inko being vindictive and aware she wasn't likely to win the court case to keep her son. They decided to skip the speculation and just jump into planning. They had a student to rescue after all. Izuku sighed from his spot, wrapped as well as possible around the sweet little girl he found himself in hell with. They were laying in Uri's small bed in the name of trying to get some rest after a very painful day. Overhaul had been busy that session. So instead of being sent back to the cell with merely the ache and memories of the tortuous process of sample taking and blood stealing, they were left with dizziness and arms and legs covered in bandages. Izuku had actually needed to be carried, more dragged in truth, back to the cell after he fainted from blood loss. But no one seemed too worried about their health, so they were just thrown back in the room and left to get themselves as comfortable as possible, which led to them cuddling and trying their best to ignore the burning of open wounds under rough bandages, trying to sleep off the dizziness and exhaustion in the hopes that tomorrow would be better. The teen looked over the child he found himself entrapped with, checking that she was deep in her realm of dreams before finally allowing himself to really rest his eyes, doing his best to relax, trying not to think about how much he missed his friends and family, blocking out thoughts of exploding machinery, laughter-filled meals, and sparking eyes. Being homesick would only make him feel worse after all. It started with distant telling and a large bang that shook the walls around them. Izuku had been doing his best to distract Uri after their bland lunch, showing her how to set her stuffies up to play tea party. He wasn't sure the concept of what a tea party was really made sense to her, but she seemed content to emulate what he did. They had just gotten into the swing of things, Izuku clumsily miming pouring tea from a plastic teapot, almost dropping it when his bound hands struggled with the awkward angle, and the sudden uptick of noise from above startled the both of them. Uri scampered over to hide behind the bed. Izuku followed as quickly as he could to stand between her and whatever mess was happening outside. It took a few minutes, but the door was unlocked, knob jiggling with the opener's frantic movements, and then it was thrown open. One of the men always following Overhaul around raced through, spotting them and barking orders for them to get up and come with him. Izuku growled and kicked out at the man as he snatched towards them. The henchman cursed and stumbled back before hissing and activating his quirk. Uri screamed as her dress was yanked forwards into the man's hand, dragging her along with it. The hero student wasn't quick enough to react, and Izuku was left grabbing for empty air. "Come quietly, brat. I'm not afraid to hurt the girl if I need to. The boss can just put her back together again later after all." The teen glowered at the man, but after a moment nodded his agreement to go quietly. He couldn't bear the thought of little Uri getting hurt because of him. He went into the hall as he was ordered and allowed himself to be tugged along by the wrists, little Uri trotting to keep up with their larger steps as she was all but dragged by one hand. They made it around 3 turns before they all but ran into Overhaul and 2 of his other hangers-on. They all turned towards another hallway, this one sloping down further underground. After a few minutes' rush, there was another loud crash and what sounded like a roar from the tunnels above them. The men around them all cursed, and Overhaul scooped up Uri so they could move faster. Izuku tried to slow down as subtly as possible, stumbling a bit and dragging his feet. It took a bit, but they caught onto his game, and instead of one man dragging him around by the wrists, he ended up with one at each elbow, half carrying him through the labyrinth. Izuku felt his despair grow as they got further and further from where they started. Even if it wasn't heroes coming to save them, they could have used whatever mess was happening as a way to escape somehow. But now they were being dragged further and further from that hope, and Izuku was too tired to fight back or even think of a way to turn the situation in their favor. The green genius was doing his best to kickstart his brain into thinking through how to get out of their current situation when a white and red blur came through a solid wall. All of their little group stopped in shock at the sudden appearance before they clocked the brightly colored costume. The men around them cursed before two of the henchmen stepped forwards to take on the threat, allowing Overhaul and the last guard to continue on. Izuku started to fight back, certain he could break free since there was only one person holding on to him now, but Overhaul gave him a warning look before placing his free hand pointedly on the back of Iri's head. The threat was clear: continue causing trouble and the little girl would suffer for it. The worst part was, Iri knew it. She knew what the man's quirk would do. But she still tried to signal with her eyes for Izuku to get to safety. The hero in him would never let him leave her though, especially not if it meant causing her to have to deal with the torture of being systematically ripped apart and pieced back together. So he stumbled along beside the man who was guiding him, trying to ignore the shouts and curses coming from the fight as they slipped down the hallway. There was a shout and a yelp and then a moment of stillness, nothing echoing in their area save for the pounding of their feet as they sped walked. And then Izuku was yanked backwards by a hand on his collar. He choked for a second before he stumbled back into a broad chest. He looked back into two bright blue eyes before realizing he was now in the hands of a hero. Instead of making him feel excited like the situation might normally call for, he felt himself pale in fear, whipping back around. Overhaul had stopped in his retreat, turning around to glare at the young hero and his prize. You will give me that back and then let us leave without further complications if you know what is good for you. The small greenette felt himself be shifted slightly to the right before he was gently pushed back behind the towering figure who had grabbed him. That's not going to happen. Now, how about you hand over the little princess so she and my kuhai can skedaddle before we get started? The last part of that comment made Izuku take a second look at the man who had just saved him. He realized just how young he looked. Very obviously not out of high school yet despite the large frame and built physique. He couldn't really spare his attention for any longer than it took to note the basic details though. He needed to figure out how to help Iri. There was no way he would let that monster keep hold of her. That's not what's going to happen, you brat. These two are coming with me. If I have to kill you to make that happen, then so be it. The blonde in front of the tiny greenette started to laugh off what he assumed to be the normal villain bluster. But a calloused hand gripping onto his cape gave him pause. He glanced over and down to find desperate green eyes glaring up at him. You don't underestimate him. Overhaul's quirk eye as I please just Izuku devolved in distressed stutters. The attempt at explaining the quirk that had hurt him so much making his tongue feel like Lee. A large hand came down on top of matted curls. I know all about Overhaul, Kuhai. Don't worry, okay. My work experience agency has been investigating him for months, so just step back and the sound of running cut him off. All of them tensed as they waited to see who would come around the corner. Hirai and Inko skidded to a stop at the sight of a group of people, their eyes landing first on their boss. Sir, the blonde nurse started. The heroes. You need to. He blinked as he clocked the figure standing in between them and their leader, a figure very obviously wearing a hero costume. Well shit. Izuku. Inko stepped forwards, stormy expression locked onto her son. What the fuck do you think you're doing? The greenette's scarred hand clenched tighter onto his grip full of cape and he flinched back from the diminutive woman. Mom. Ugh. Began with the stuttering. I swear every day you get more and more useless. Get back over to Mr. Chisaki. He's literally the only reason you've ever been worth the 9 months I wasted carrying you, and you will not ruin his deal for me now. The smaller hero student winced and dropped his gaze, though he didn't make a move to rejoin Overhaul. She hissed before raising a hand and making a very familiar gesture. Izuku yelped as he was tugged towards her by his ear. The third year behind him immediately reacted, launching forwards and knocking her hand to the side with a harsh slap. She cursed and cradled her reddened appendage before her boyfriend stepped in. From there Izuku quickly lost track of the thread. Everyone was yelling and moving at once. The blonde hero, who he didn't even know the name of yet, was popping in and out of the floor and fighting off the two nurses and Overhaul's yes man. But Izuku couldn't focus on them. No, he was too busy watching Overhaul. The real threat still had control of the most crucial piece, and the weakened and tired teen was doing his best to stay out of the way of the fight and figure out how to save the little girl who had wormed her way into his heart. Izuku panted out panicked breaths as he dodged yet another spike of concrete as a wave of them shot out from the floor, chasing the young hero who had stepped in to save them. The greenette was trying to slip towards Overhaul unnoticed, his slapdash plan consisting of getting to Iri and getting her out. It might not have many steps, but he considered what it did have vitally important. Overhaul's last goon was downed, as was Kurai, and Ko was somewhere beyond the first row of spikes, trying to wake the two men and get them back in the fight. Izuku was thankful he wasn't having to fight his way through them as well as the rioting tunnels. He honestly doubted if he had the energy left to do much more than what was absolutely necessary in that moment. The loss of far too much blood the night before and the light lunch that day truly took their toll on his energy level and thought processes. The small teen rolled out of the way of a chunk of debris before sliding into the villain's blind spot, ready and waiting for his chance. It came as the blonde hero dodged a swipe from a dangerous hand. Green eyes locked on Overhaul's slipping grip on Eri. Within a second, Izuku was dashing from his hiding spot, yanking the girl free and tossing her back down the hall towards freedom. Eri, go get the heroes. Let them know where we are. He had to pray the girl listened as a furious mob boss was now lashing out at him. He managed to move out of the way enough to miss the first few swipes, but his luck ran out as his ankle turned sharply on a loose chunk of concrete. Terrifying fingers latched onto his wrists, using them to yank him back towards the monster they were trying to escape. The boy was maneuvered to be back to chest with his nightmare. A hand latched around his throat threateningly. Green eyes watched as his savior came up short, a tiny shadow hidden behind him. Eri, run! The greenette yelled as forcefully as he could, startling the little girl into action. She took off, and Izuku heard Overhaul growl before starting to call her back. With the last of his energy, the small teen twisted and drove one of his elbows back and up into the man's diaphragm. He choked on the air as it left him before doubling over and tightening his grip on the tanned skin in his grasp. Izuku's world dissolved into needles and heat. By the time he was able to see through the static, Overhaul had recovered and was holding his limp body as a shield, threatening the hero student with using his quirk on the smaller boy yet again. The freckled teen tried to squirm to see if he had any leeway, but the arm across his chest felt like a steel band and the hand around his neck tightened in warning against his probing movement. Izuku complied, his body not really feeling up to moving much at that moment anyways. Instead, he did his best to look beyond the flowing red cape of the teen standing in Overhaul's way, desperately trying to see if Eri really had followed his instructions. A delicate voice cursing up a storm in decidedly not curse words alerted them to the fact that Inko was approaching them from behind and to the right where her little hidey hole had been. Both of them are truly out of commission, sir. Where's the girl? Overhaul growled and gave Izuku a shake. The little brat here decided to play hero. We will have to go back to find her once I finish off this annoying little fly. We still need our main ingredient after all. The teen in his grip gritted his teeth at Eri yet again being called an ingredient, but wisely kept his mouth shut. The hero student across from them had no such survival instincts though and took a stance. That will not happen. My name is Lemillion, and my goal is to save 1 million people. And these two kids will definitely be some of that goal. Well, Izuku had his name now. If he could get his tongue to work, he would tell the other hero student to run and make sure he got out. But as it was, he was still buzzing from being overhauled, and he didn't think he would be able to speak clearly enough to be understood. As the villain and hero settled into a stalemate with the smaller teen stuck in the middle, Izuku hoped backup was on the way. The Racerhead and present Mike were a force of nature on the rare occasion they were on a scene together. Like the sun, the loud blonde would race ahead and dazzle everyone with his flash and Pete's ass, giving his silent shadow the perfect opportunity to swoop in and deal final blows without their adversaries seeing him coming. It was this smooth and well-practiced teamwork that led to them racing ahead after Mirio. The teen hadn't listened to orders and had gone on ahead when the halls had become tangled spaghetti around them, and the two teachers were determined to catch up to both him and their real target. So imagine their surprise when yet another child appears before them. A tiny little thing in a threadbare dress running through the hall towards them before skidding to a stop. They also stopped, uncertain of exactly what was happening. The small girl took a moment to catch her breath, just enough to ask a question. Are you heroes? The question snapped the two men from their small spirals of questioning, and Mike knelt to be closer to her height. We sure are, kiddo. Who are? There's no time. Izuku, he said, to bring heroes. Come on. With that, she was off again, running back the way she had come before either of them had a chance to stop her. In a blink, both men were on her heels, she had said Izuku. And if they were going to be blessed with a guide, well then, neither of them were in the right mind to argue. After a moment, Yamada managed to catch up to the little sprite who had appeared from nowhere, taking half a brain cell to worry that she was part of a trap before smothering the thought with his fear of missing his chance to save one of his kids. The blonde hero scooped the toddler up into his arms. Point where we need to go, little listener. Eraser and I will save Izuku, I promise. They followed her directions to the letter. Thankfully, she didn't seem to have taken any turns down side tunnels unless there was literally no other way to go. Smart girl. It made it very easy to head back the way she had come. It honestly didn't take them long to find the objective for this whole mess. They turned a corner and there he was, being held against the very distinctive form of the head villain as Tagada did his best to stall for time. Like the pros they were, they instantly reacted to the presence of a threat. Eri was shoved back around the corner and told to stay put. And then the two men stepped up to stand shoulder to shoulder with their third-year student. Eraserhead quietly asked for a rundown from Lemillion, and Hisashi listened in as well as he could. But he was definitely distracted by the sight of the kid they had been searching for. Izuku looked a bit worse for wear, covered in bandages and a bit out of it, almost like he had been drugged or had taken a hit to the head. But beyond that, what drew attention was the absolute terror in his eyes, as if the man who was holding him hostage was a lot scarier than the three trying to save him could even comprehend. That fear was quickly explained when Mirio got to the part of his story where Izuku managed to free the girl, Eri apparently, only to enrage the monster, who then got a hold of the greenette instead. When Hisashi heard of his son disappearing into mist for a moment before coming back screaming, he almost let loose a scream himself, the only thing stopping him being the fact that Izuku would be caught in the crossfire. Eraserhead took control as he usually did, activating his quirk to keep their son from being harmed again, even while he activated a distress beacon and called in their situation to HQ up on the surface. It was unlikely more backup would make it in time or be of any use, but this way they at least had the eventuality of help. Once Eraser gave them the signal, Lemillion and Mike sprang into action, taking advantage of Overhaul's quirk being out of commission for a moment. They weren't expecting the small woman standing beside him to use her quirk though. Inko used pull on Mirio's cape, tugging him just enough to misstep. As the blonde stumbled, he was forced to activate his own quirk as a deadly hand shot forwards and through his chest. The quirk might have been erased, but he didn't want to be hit either way. Mike yelped and kicked out towards Overhaul to divert the man, only to have to pull the blow as his son was used as a shield. He was then distracted by a quirk-fueled yank on his pointy hair. Mike grit his teeth as he was dragged back and forth. Frustrated with not being able to free himself in the normal ways, he instead grabbed the knife he kept hidden under his jacket, and with 3 hacks he was freed. And Inko was in trouble. Her pull had of course brought the hero closer to her. Too close. In 2 steps he was on her, and all it took was 1 DJ punch to put her out of commission. Then it was 3 heroes against the biggest baddie. Normally this would be an easy fight, especially since Eraserhead was one of the heroes. But Overhaul still had a hostage. Izuku was a bit more steady on his feet by this point, and aware enough to realize that this was his chance, that he needed to help before Shouta had to blink. So he did his best to gather the last of his energy, what little was left after what was essentially 3 days of torture and too little food. Grabbing at the hand that was around his neck and the arm attached to it, he took a step forwards and forced his upper body to follow. As he curled in on himself, the villain he was attached to went with him. Overhaul sailed gracelessly over his hostage's shoulder before landing on his back with an unrefined thud. Lemillion was on the man in a second, flipping the villain onto his belly and pulling his hands behind his back. Eraser strained to keep from blinking until Mike's cuffs were around the man's wrists. As Shouta doused his eyes with drops, hissing as they stung in protest, Mirio took the extra cuffs he was carrying to go and bind the rest of the billions in the tunnel. Mike, on the other hand, was all over their previously missing kid. He scooped the small greenette up into a hug, fussing and worrying at him the whole time. But Izuku was distracted. After letting the man have a moment, the teen sought out Shouta, getting his attention with a wave of his bound hands before finger-spilling ERI. A blink was his only response before the hero walked back around the corner to fetch the child that had led them to where they needed to be. Knowing that the girl was in good hands, Izuku finally allowed himself a moment to relax, sinking into the hug and the frenzy of 2 fast words as one of his people made sure he was safe. By the time Shouta was back with their little rescue, he had already called back in to let the others know that they had Overhaul in custody and their target was in hero hands, asking for backup to come and help them escort the villains up to the paddy wagons. Until help arrived, they were essentially stuck. As experienced heroes, they took the moment to rest, settling the 2 kids down a bit aways from the group of bad guys and making them sit while Eraser picked the lock on Izuku's cuffs. Once he was sure they were okay, Mike walked back over to help keep an eye on their acquisitions, leaving the 2 young ones to his capable husband. Eventually, the cuffs gave a click before a gentle tug freed the teen. Shouta frowned down at the raw skin under where they had been, obviously grazed from when the kid had judo flipped his captor. The hero pulled out some disinfectant and a bit of gauze to take care of the small injury before they had to move again. The freckled boy smiled up at his hero, appreciating the care and the small gestures, before looking over to Eri. The little girl was quiet, gaze trained on the irritable form of her tormentor, where the man was yelling at Lemillion down the hallway. Izuku decided she needed a distraction. ASAP, he gently nudged her with an elbow, getting her attention before giving her a smile. Hey, wanna know a secret? He whispered conspiratorially. When he got a hesitant nod in reply, he went forwards with his little plan. He gestured with his head to the man who was wrapping his wrists, continuing to whisper his secret. This is pro hero Eraserhead. And you wanna know what? He's my dad. His eyes went wide as Aizawa finished trying off the gauze, and Izuku used his freed hand to gesture to Hasashi, continuing. And that present Mike, he's my other dad. Her quiet well was almost enough to distract Shouta from the fluttery warm feeling in his chest at hearing one of his sons claim him in that way. Yeah, and even better, I have a mom back home too. At that she looked confused before glancing over to where Inko and her boyfriend were starting to recover. The greenette winced. Yeah, that's complicated. Let's just say. She's not my mom anymore, Shouta hummed to himself, drawing the both of their attention before he reached forwards to gently tousle matted green curls. I'm proud of you, kiddo. Now come on, the other should be here in a second. And you've got a whole bunch of boys waiting for you topside. Not to mention 2 pink forces of nature. The teen giggled before standing and scooping up the small girl he had been held captive with. He knew she must be tired. He might be tired as well. But he also knew that the next hour or two would be a lot for the both of them. But he had hoped that soon they could rest, safe, and with his loving family and partners around them. Bakugo Katsuki fought like a rabid animal as the police drug him from the Yakuza hideout. He had lost to Rocklock of all people. The hero managed to lock his hands palm to palm after a long fight, thus disarming him and making it easy for the man to slip cuffs over his wrists. But still he didn't want to admit defeat. 2 cops had to practically drag him free of the underground warren as he thrashed and screamed his discontent, uncaring of the show he was putting on for the media. When he saw a small greenette sitting on the back of an ambulance being smothered by 3 of his former classmates, he really lost it. He used his boosted rage to finally twist free of the hold the 2 policemen had on him, before charging the object of his eternal ire. He watched as green eyes widened as the smaller teen noticed his rapid approach, the fear in them sending a spike of satisfaction through the blonde attacker. But, just as he started to shift his body to attack with a kick, he was forcefully stopped by a punch to the face on one side, quickly followed by a bicep around his neck. He choked in his shock as he was slammed onto his back, gasping for his lost breath as he stared up at the furious forms of Todoroki and Shinso. He could see the blonde hair of Kaminari behind them, standing guard over his target as the other 2 made sure he stayed down until the cops caught back up. As the budding villain was hauled back to his feet, he was met with the furious gazes of 3 protective hero students, all of them glaring hotly enough to fry an egg. It was Shinso who spoke up. If you ever come near him again, a black eye will be the least of your worries. He has people who love and support him now. We will never let you hurt him again. Bakugo's snarled response was cut off as he was yanked away towards a paddy wagon. The 3 teens stood watching the struggling firecracker until he was in the vehicle and locked down out of sight before turning to their boyfriend, their worried gazes finding green eyes staring up at them with a complicated mix of emotions. Love, awe, disbelief. So many things in Izuku's gaze after being protected by 3 beautiful boys. Denki settled back down on the bumper with him while smothering the greenette in hugs and questions, and the other 2 took up positions standing across from them and blocking a bit of the busy world off. They just kind of sat there for a few minutes, relaxing and appreciating that they were all together again. But a soft knock from the inside of the ambulance had Denki helping Izuku stand. Hasashi opened the door, little Eri standing beside the hero and peeking out shyly. She's all set, kiddos. It's Izuku's turn now. And then we will head to UA for debrief. RG will probably also want to do a more in-depth check afterwards. Izuku sighed and accepted the hand up into the vehicle, kneeling down to be eye level with the skittish little one hiding behind his dad's legs. Hey Yuri, they want us in here one at a time. Do you think you would be okay sitting with my partners for a little bit? Partners? Yeah, remember I told you about them. This eye is Denki, Itoshi, and Shouto, he introduced while pointing and giving a pause so each boy could acknowledge the girl and say hello. They're the ones I went to the water park with, remember? I bet if you ask nicely Denki would tell you more stories about it. When her eyes lit up with curiosity, he smiled and gently guided her hand into his electric boyfriend's, watching as the other teen wholeheartedly and cheerfully stepped into the role of distraction, helping Eri step down to the pavement and starting up a story of his epic fail in the surfing simulator. The greenette let himself be guided onto the gurney as the door closed, getting ready for a field checkup from an EMT. He let the man remove the wrapping from around his wrists and the ones from his upper forearms, Hasashi hissing in sympathy at the sight of his skinned wrists. But the lines and needle marks from the samples that had been taken the day before were healed, nothing but faint white lines, gone after the last overhaul he had endured. Izuku explained the existence of the bandages and why the wounds were gone to the confused medic in concise clipped sentences, giving him the bare minimum so he wouldn't fuss, but not really wanting to think of the whole experience much if he didn't have to. The look his father figure gave him at his dodging of questions let the boy know that the tactic wouldn't fly for long, but at least he was willing to give the kid a bit more time before pressing the issue. After he had the all clear to do what he needed until he could get to a more in-depth health professional, they joined the others back outside. Shouta had also made an appearance, watching from off to the side as Denki amused Eri with a story about some shenanigan or other he had gotten up to with Ishido and Kirishima. Izuku smiled softly at his most energetic boyfriend as he gestured widely with his hands, emulating something exploding or some other sort of mess being made. His soft giggle drew the attention of those gathered, and Izuku felt his heart flutter as all three of his boys immediately turned to him with small smiles of their own. He accepted Hitoshi's help down from the ambulance and let himself be guided down the road as Aizawa caught Hisashi up to speed. The Greenette relaxed at hearing that the entire complex had been swept and all Yakuza members inside had been apprehended. If most of the organization was under arrest, it was unlikely that he and Eri would be a target again anytime soon. He leaned into the warm side of his partner and let himself be ushered towards the familiar SUV he could see parked down the street, humming in contentment as a strong arm was draped gently across the back of his shoulders, idly watching as Eri let her hand be held by his loud blonde, still listening as Denki spun yet another overinflated tale of hijinks and hooligans. When they started loading up, he could tell his three boyfriends all wanted to sit as close to him as possible. But he knew he needed to put his foot down in this one, making Denki and Hitoshi climb into the back before settling himself into the center seat. Eri might have been okay letting Denki hold her hand as they walked down a wide open road, but he didn't want to push her too far by forcing her into close contact with someone who was essentially a stranger. So Shouto was the one who got to subtly press close to Izuku as the Greenette hijacks his phone to show his little friend cat videos online. It took about an hour to reach their destination, but only about 20 minutes for the two newly freed children to pass out, their long day catching up to them quickly. If Hisashi bullied Shouta into sneaking a photo of them leaning against each other fast asleep, well, none of the boys in the back would say anything. It was super sweet after all, and none of them would deny that knowing their little green ray of sunshine was good with kids made them all love him just that tiny bit more. Eventually, though, they did reach the underground parking lot at UA. Waking the two of them up felt like such a shame, but it needed to be done so they could get them to proper beds as soon as possible. Once they has disembarked the vehicle, Hitoshi teasing Denki after he had to catch the blonde when he was climbing free and his leg gave out and went pins and needles after having gone numb during the ride. They headed up into the main building where they had a whole slew of people waiting for them. They didn't even manage to get all the way out of the elevator before Mia and Mei attacked. Before Izuku could react, he was scooped up onto strong arms and practically smothered in pink-tinted worry. He probably would have freaked out about the suddenness of the hug, but he had half expected it, and the smell of motor oil and Mia's citrusy soap cued him in on being safe. Well, that, and Mei's deluge of information on all the things she had built to keep him from getting kidnapped again. She immediately started enacting her plans, not even asking before tossing a length of silvery chain around his neck. He blinked and found the pendant attached to it, a simple locket-like heart with 4 gems studded into it. Mei leaned over his shoulder and around her mom's arm to point at the small sparklies: amethyst, emerald, topaz, and sapphire. I was going to go for ruby for Todoroki, but the blue matched his eye and has fire in the name. Kuroyama is very convincing. She then dug around in a pocket before holding up 3 matching necklaces. Each of them has a tracker behind the picture inside. I'm going to give Nezu the blueprint for the tracker and start a petition to have every hero student keep one on them at all times because, honestly, 2 kidnappings in 2 months is absolutely not cool. She huffed with a playful glare before turning to look at the others who had filtered into the hall around them, forcing one of the necklaces onto each of the boyfriends before turning a threatening look onto the 2 pro heroes. You 2 have your own trackers coming soon as well, and I won't take no for an answer. I'm tired of my family disappearing on me. Just tell me what kind of accessories you want because Kuroyama needs to know so he can make the shells. With one more glare around to make sure everyone knew how serious she was about the topic, she huffed and then gave her honorary brother a proper hug. With Izuku effectively squashed between the 2 women, he let himself relax into his fate and sunk into the hugs. He let them get their fill until a small tug on his finger caught his attention. Glancing down to see a worried red gaze reminded him of how odd the whole situation might have seemed to outsiders. He did look like he was being smothered after all. So with a gentle shrug, he let the 2 Hatsumes know he needed space, being freed surprisingly quickly. He then knelt down to be eye level with Eri and smiled. Hey, don't worry. These are the Hatsumes. You remember me telling you about the shop, right? The little girl relaxed a bit at the introduction, turning her big red eyes from Izuku's to Mia's and studying the woman closely. You're his real mom. His other mom was really mean. You're not mean, are you? The Greenette did his best to hide his flinch at that comment and ducked his head, suddenly incredibly uncomfortable, afraid to look up to Mia and see what kind of reaction she had to such a forward question. To his surprise, he caught the movement out of the corner of his eye as the woman settled into a crouch next to him. Yeah, kiddo, I'm kind of his mom. It's not official yet, but the paperwork has been filled out and I was going to ask if he wanted me to file it once his other mom was out of the picture. And I try my best to be nice, though I'm told I make a mean meatloaf. She let the words settle, waiting for the waterworks. And she wasn't let down as Izuku launched himself into her chest as soon as the words truly registered, tears flowing freely, though surprisingly silently. The only noise he made being a choked, "Really?" Mia laughed softly. "Of course, honey. You just fit into our den of genius and chaos far too well. We already started cleaning out the guest room for you, though I thought about leaving those boxes of parts from my college days for you to play with." He giggled at her lighthearted rambling. "I'd love that." The red-headed woman smiled down at him softly, knowing he was talking about more than the parts. "I'd love it too, Izuku." A group of adults sat solemnly around a conference table. The sun was setting on UA, and while they would all love to go home and crawl into their beds, they knew they still had some things to go over before that could happen. Things like a treatment plan for the trauma the two rescued kids had obviously endured. Said kids were settled in the infirmary, napping and surrounded by hero students and one specific support genius. After a debrief that scarred all of the adults who had listened to it and a couple of quick scans for lasting damage to their bodies, they had all but collapsed when told to rest. There had been some issues during their checkups, obvious issues pertaining to needles for one thing. That of course made plenty of sense when the debrief was taken into consideration, of course. So no one had said anything when Eri refused to sleep by herself. Instead, take up a spot tucked into Izuku's side on the green teen's bed. She had watched everyone with a silent and judging gaze until her eyes were too heavy to keep open and she fell asleep. Seeing the two of them curled up together was as adorable as it was heartbreaking. And Shadow was already planning what needed to be changed in their last guest room to make it a better space for such a small kid, because he knew his husband was already gone for their new kid. But first they needed to finish filing paperwork and all of the other boring parts of heroing so they could get the kids home. So they split up the tasks, Tsukachi calling CPS while heroes who were on the raid filled out reports and Nezu called in favors, Hatsum running in between them all and helping where she could. It might take them a few hours, but all of them were determined to go home that night. So they worked away at all that needed doing with a single-mindedness similar to hyperfocus. They made it back to the Yamezawa household right before midnight. Midnight had been nominated to take Denki and Shadow home. Their parents worried about how much they had been away. So it was just the Yamezawas and the Hatsums. Instead of trying to pry a sleepy Eri away from an exhausted Izuku, the adults instead grabbed all of the spare blankets and such from around the house and made a large pile on the living room floor. Mei and Shinso making quick work of making it into a comfortable mess. Shinso ended up taking the couch, not wanting to crowd the floor too much, and Mei the space closest to the window. That left the other two plenty of room to nest down. As the adults left to head upstairs and get the guest room turned down for Mia, the four kids were already starting to drift. Nothing but a few more quiet murmurs between them as they all finally relaxed after so many tense days spent in worry. Hazashi made sure he left the cat room light on so they could see if they woke up in the night before following the other two up. He didn't want to leave his kids alone, but he could admit that if he wanted to be in any way functional to help them when they needed it, then he needed sleep. Several days of restless dozing in chairs or on the occasional couch were taking their toll. And he knew all three of the adults could use the rest now that their missing duckling was back safe. The smell of fresh pastries woke the kids as Mia carried a box in through the front door. It had been a rough night with both Eri and Izuku waking up several times from nightmares. Their parentals had let them sleep in until almost noon before the woman had gone down to the nearest little shop to grab them a sugary treat to wake up to. Every step of that journey turned out to be worth it as they discovered Eri's sweet tooth. The little girl tore into apple danishes like she had never tasted anything better. The others all caved and let her try bites of their own sweets as well, much to her sugar rush-powered joy. They did end up sending her upstairs with Mia to get a bath afterwards, though. It amazed all of them, save the woman who had actually raised a toddler, just how messy one kid could get when armed with a donut. While she washed up, the rest of them got ready for the day. Izuku lent Mia a set of his overalls and a t-shirt. He had also grabbed a shirt to use as a dress for Eri. But Mia had already thought ahead and grabbed a couple of cheesy things small enough to fit the little one from a tourist shop on her way back from the breakfast run. The first half of the day was spent in slightly lazy movement. The two heroes were constantly on the phone, tying up loose ends, but the kids were mostly left to their own devices. With Hitoshi's newest game system now set up in his dorm room, they were stuck with the older one from back before there were actual teens in the apartment, which was honestly fine with them. They didn't want to overwhelm Eri with a whole holographic setup right off the bat. Instead, they settled on playing a remaster of one of the early Zelda games. The little girl especially loved the parts where they got to use the ocarina. She said it sounded pretty and asked if there was any chance she could learn to play something like that one day. Unfortunately, or fortunately, for her, Yamada had chosen that moment to walk through the room towards the kitchen. The teens were sure, judging by the look on his face, the kiddo would have her pick of instruments as fast as the internet could ship them. After a delicious lunch of oyakodon made by Mia with Izuku's help, the woman had to leave. She needed to check on her shop and catch up on back orders, and the rest of them needed to head back to UA. The teens involved in the incident wouldn't be asked to go back to classes for a few days yet, but the adults had left their lessons to the other teachers and needed to take back over before their coworkers got too overrun. They made their way to the teachers' dorms first. Officially, they were just there so the adults could grab all of the grading and paperwork they might need. But in reality, they all just wanted to introduce Eri to the magic of cats. And introduce they did. Lucky in particular seemed to be absolutely taken with the small child. The small calico followed at her heels as Eri got a tour of the small dorm and the communal dining area, absolutely lapping up every millisecond of attention the girl would give her. It was adorable. Eventually, they all settled down around the living area. Aizawa at the small desk with a stack of essays to grade, Yamada nearby responding to emails on his laptop, and the four kids grouped up on and in front of the couch with the TV playing a movie about a boy being shrunk down and becoming friends with slugs. Izuku and Mei had found a couple of lap-sized tinker projects somewhere to keep their hands busy. The greenette visibly relaxing at getting back to doing something so mundane for him. A few hours later, a knock on the door announces Snipe's arrival. The hero smiled and waved at the kids when Hisashi opened the door for him, but got down to business fairly quickly. 8. Nedzu got the paperwork for the Lil One's foster situation all settled, so I'll be shifting ours up to the top floor and Cementos will be air in about an hour to move some wall round to give the girl a room. The blonde man blinked before giving his coworker a small and sincere smile. You didn't have to move, Colt. We would have figured it out. No, it's fine. All I really have is my gear and some clothes. It'll take an hour tops to shift things over. Val Lil Bit deserves to have her own space, so I don't mind. With a few more assurances and a bit of small talk, the man left to go move his things. By the time Cementos freed himself from his duties rebuilding whatever had been destroyed in training that day, the other hero was already moved into what was originally intended as an attic space. The construction hero settled Snipe's needs first, moving the bathroom and such up and setting him up with his own kitchen. And then he started shifting walls around. In the end, the Yamazawa dorm gained about 10 square feet of living room space and an extra bedroom. Hound Dog also got a bit of extra living room, much to his surprise. It immediately became a craft corner, the hero setting up shelving for his yarn stash within the week, a comfy chair and a standing lamp completing the area. He could reliably be found there working on one project or another whenever he had a free hour or two from then on. The small family spent the time while things were getting moved around online. Yamada and Eri in the center of the couch while the man coaxed her through choosing things for her new room. He discovered quickly that she didn't like dolls, but her reaction to the cat-shaped beanbag was adorable. Though to be honest, the man had to buy 2 of those because of Hitoshi's obvious interest. Izuku was draped over the back of the couch behind them, occasionally pointing to something on the screen or piping up with a suggestion. The kid was habitually quiet on his own wants and needs, but as soon as they were shopping for someone else, he was all in, making sure his little rescue had everything she might need, including clothes, though the sheer number of plushies in their cart was probably unnecessary. Shouta eventually made them all a quick dinner of tempura veggies, miso soup, and rice, and then it was time for the boys to head back to their own dorms. Izuku made sure Eri was comfortable enough to sleep on the couch alone that night, but he needn't worry. The kid had completely fallen for Hisashi and his bubbly energy, trusting the man to keep her safe. It probably also helped that Luck had settled into her lap and was purring up a storm. With confirmation that their new little sister would be just fine, the boys allowed Shouta to walk them back over to their dorms, dropping Mei off before heading to Heights Alliance. The lights from the large windows spilled out over the grass as they walked by in the dusky gloom, making their way to the front door. They did not reach it before there was the thunder of footsteps from inside, preceding the door being thrown open and solidly half of the class rushing outside in their slippers. They were as loud as ever, and Izuku winced and reached up to flip off his aids, not wanting to get overstimulated. Hitoshi snorted and made sure he was in sight in order to translate if he needed to. Eventually, their other 2 partners managed to weave through the throng, coming to stand with their prodigal paramours as Aizawa glared and started demanding order amongst his students. They eventually all made it into the dorm proper, finding the rest of their class sitting in the common areas. Apparently, Denki had mentioned they were coming back that evening, and everyone had wanted to see for themselves that Izuku was okay. Shouta left them to deal with the mayhem, warning the class that they still needed to be in their rooms by curfew on his way out the door. Izuku did eventually turn his ears back on, once everyone had settled down enough to relax on the couches and speak at reasonable levels. As the greenette sank further into Shouta's warm side, he smiled softly to himself, wondering over all of the love his found family was always too willing to show for him, and pondering over how different his life in that moment was to his L3AFE the year before. He definitely appreciated the changes. The trials start with Chisaki, of course, and spiral into madness from there. The man gets a life sentence in Tartarus, expected of a high-level villain with a powerful quirk. Kurai gets 20 years for child abduction and medical malpractice. He was practically frothing at the mouth when they read the verdict, screaming that you can't abduct a Quirkless because they are not human. Eventually, the bailiffs managed to drag him through the door toward his transport. Aizawa was relieved he had managed to talk Izuku out of attending this one, because he really didn't need to hear that drivel. Unfortunately, no one could keep the teen from the last 2 trials of note. Bakugo went first. The blonde was muzzled and chained to his bench, announced as an incredibly violent flight risk. As the Greenette entered the room behind the prosecuting lawyer, the teen made eye contact with a completely different set of red eyes. These were filled to the brim with tears and regret. Izuku allowed Mitsuki Bakugo and her quiet shadow to approach, giving her a bittersweet smile. "Hi, Auntie. Long time no see." The woman sniffled before pulling the boy into a hug. "I'm so sorry, Izuku," she whispered into his hair. "This is all my fault. I was just so blind. I have no idea how I missed what Inko and Katsuki were doing to you all of these years. And then for them too. She cut off as her voice choked. Her husband laid a hand on her shoulder and guided her a step away from the Greenette, noticing that the 2 men behind Izuku were eyeing their exchange warily. As Mitsuki took a few deep breaths to settle herself, Masaru knelt to be below the teen's height, bowing deeply with a sincere apology dropping from his lips. The boy froze for a moment before frantically trying to pull the man up, but the brunette wouldn't be budged until he said his whole piece. "Izuku, we have done wrong by you. We have always thought of you as a second son, and yet we failed both you and our blood child so spectacularly. Please, if you could ever find it in you to forgive us, I swear we will do whatever we can to make this better. Not right. It will never be right, but as good as we can make it. If ever you need anything, we will do anything in our power to provide it. All you need to do is say the word. Whatever, whenever, I swear." He didn't look up until he was done with his pre-planned speech. Finding himself face to face with tear-covered freckles, he huffed a half-laugh before reaching up slowly to dab at chubby cheeks with his Gucci shirt sleeve. "Ah, Izuku, you always were a crier." He was rocked back by a tackle hug as Izuku sobbed that of course he forgave them, that it wasn't really their fault, that all 3 of them kept how bad things were a secret from the elder Bakugos, and that he appreciated the sentiment but he really didn't need anything from them. After that, they only had a few minutes to compose themselves before they needed to take their seats on opposite sides of the courtroom. The trial didn't go well. At first, it wasn't too bad. The prosecution and defense both made their cases with little input from anyone else. A recorded interview with Izuku was played, embarrassing the shit out of the teen, though he knew that was better than being asked to go on the stand. The only way Tsukachi had managed to wrangle the allowance for the videos was by playing the disabled card, playing on his deafness and stuttered to convince both judges to submit to the special treatment. It went like a normal day at court until they got to the part where Katsuki was asked to give his own statement on events. The Quirkless tirade was expected, if not appreciated. Izuku sunk into himself a bit as the blonde went on in his rage. Eventually, after calling for order and being ignored, the judge motioned for the muzzle to be reinstated. It didn't take long after that for the proceedings to come to a close. The jury found him unanimously guilty and the judge sequestered to deliberate his sentence. A minimum of 20 years for severe bodily harm and being an accessory to a kidnapping, as well as resisting arrest. And he had mandatory therapy for his obvious personality disorder. He would not be allowed parole until his therapist cleared him as no longer a threat to the public. The blonde at the stand was furious, fighting his escort as he was dragged from the room, screams muffled by the mask strapped to his face. It took 4 men to get him into the hall, and 5 minutes before those in the room could no longer hear the struggle. Mitsuki was quietly crying again, looking as if the world had been ripped out from under her feet. Izuku quietly asked his dads to wait up for a moment, the men easily agreeing and stepping away to speak to the persecutor. The small green teen quickly slipped between those who were leaving and made his way to the bench where his aunt and uncle sat. When his presence got their attention, the blonde woman did her best to straighten up and scrub her face clear of her grief. But the boy only smiled, not concerned with the fact that she was hurt beyond the need to help her heal. He held out his phone, opened to his contact book. "Why will you give me your number? Inko never gave me the new 01. And I think you'd like my mom. Maybe you two could have a coffee." There was a pause as the 2 confused adults exchanged a look. Your mom, the one in jail." Green eyes blinked before he realized the problem. "Oh, no, Hatsumiya. She's after Inko's trial. She signed the adoption papers last week and now she after the verdict CPS will make it official." He trailed off as he was once again smothered in a hug. "Oh kiddo, I'm so happy to hear you found someone. So quickly too. Actually, I've known Hatsum-sen for about a year now. I've been working in her shop after school and her daughter and I are friends," he says sheepishly. Mitsuki pulls back to cradle freckled cheeks. "That's fucking fantastic. You have a mom and a sister now. I need to meet her for sure." Gotta make sure for myself that she's a good match after all. I would die if I let you be cared for by another Inko. And what's this about a shop? You're already getting work experience. What an energetic lil go-getter. Izuku and Masaru share an amused look as the woman gets her excitement at the new situation out of her system. Green curls gaining a gentle ruffle, and the man smiles softly at the boy he had once thought of as a son. I'm happy for you, Izuku. We would love to meet you, Mom. Just text us a when and we're okay. They parted ways soon after, Yamada and Aizawa giving the other two adults wary nods as they drew their kid away and to their car. It was time to head back to the dorms and the movie night that was brewing in the 1A common room. For Inko's trial, Mia closed her shop down for the day so she could sit in and try and glare the other woman to death from across the room. Shouta made sure to sit in between her and the defendant so he could step in if either of them tried something. Izuku really didn't need both of his maternal figures in jail after all. The boy in question was sandwiched between his mom and his Ashi, safe and guarded and able to tuck himself back out of sight of Inko if he felt the need. At the moment he was focusing on Yamada, refusing to look her way, playing up being enthralled with a tale from the radio station as they waited for the proceeding. Eventually the judge entered and things got started. Listening to all of the years of neglect was heartbreaking, especially for Mia as the woman remembered bits and pieces of little things the teen had done when they had met. A lot of his habits made more sense now. When Inko was called to the stand to be cross-examined, a lot of the jury and spectators were surprised at how cold she sounded in her answer, if not outright saying that the mistreatment and abuse of her son was warranted, then trying to turn the issue around to be one of her own suffering. But none of them were having it, especially the judge. She called the woman out multiple times for the lapses in parenting and hurtful words. By the time the jury found her guilty, no one was surprised save the furious green-haired woman on trial. And when the judge handed down her sentence, she also let her have her opinion, outright calling Inko a narcissistic bully in front of the whole court before she even gave her the decision of 30 years with no parole. Unlike her boyfriend and the boy she led astray, the small woman made no fuss at the announcement, but she did stand to give a statement when asked. All I have to say is that the thing that I made the mistake of birthing has done nothing but ruin my life since the moment it entered the world. I'm glad that after today I'll never have to see it again. And I hope with every fiber of my body that it dies regretting every second of its pitiful existence. With that, she stepped back away from the microphone and allowed herself to be led from the room. The words hurt, but Izuku had been braced for them, knowing she would likely say something along those lines. What he wasn't ready for was the fact that not once as she walked across the room did she look back over at him. This was likely the last time they would ever see each other, and Inko didn't even glance in the direction of the child she had forced into the world. It unexpectedly hit harder than he would have guessed. The last bit of closure he needed being ripped away at the last second by the woman who had spent his whole life hurting him. And here she was getting in one last emotional stab before leaving his life forever. Unfortunately for her, he had a real support system now, and they descended upon him as soon as the door closed behind the bitch, smothering him in hugs and their worry and completely distracting him from any hurt as his hindbrain got a second to process. They got him back to UA fairly quickly, only stopping for takeout. And if 3 boys and 2 girls were awaiting their arrival in the Amezawa dorm, well, it was to be expected, as was the cuddle pile that formed in front of the TV as everyone ate their food. Hours later, as the adults sipped coffee and watched over the slumbering pile of limbs, there would be quiet vows of protection and support from all 3 parental figures, determination solidifying into iron will to never let their kids be harmed again if they had any say. And they would have lots of say. The downfall of the public schools was all anyone could talk about over Christmas break. The trial had started off hidden, a hush-hush backdoor affair that was never meant to go public. After seeing the first school district on the docket, Izuku had a good guess as to who leaked the drama. His guess included white fur and 2 smart eyes. The proceedings were long and drawn out, a panel of judges listening to the prosecutors and defenders for no less than 30 different school districts. All of them were accused of neglect or discrimination, or both. And as the head chairman for the board of directors at Aldera stepped up to the podium, the world watched and judged and, for the most part, cheered the largest overhaul of a public school system in the world in over 50 years. Izuku sold the patent for his first hero-grade hearing aids about a week before he finished his upgraded designs for his new ones. These included a slimmer, more discreet profile and a whole buttload of new features, including an AI he had written entirely from scratch as a project in his private lessons with Nezu. He kept his testing of prototypes discreet for the first month after that, working out bugs and making sure self-activating resource interface worked correctly and did everything he wanted her to do. The only ones who knew of the project were Power Loader, Nezu, Mei, and Hitoshi. The first 2 because he needed their sign-off to use school resources for his build, and the last 2 because he needed help with his tests on occasion. By the time he was ready to put in for a patent, he had a whole slew of extra sets built. A main and a spare for himself and Hisashi, as well as 10 more pairs he was donating to first responders who'd had their hearing damaged in the line of duty. The charity had been Mia's idea. Well, in a way. The woman had been regaling Izuku and Mei over dinner of her days in the support course with Power Loader. And one of her stories had been of a charity drive they had done in their 3rd year to get their names out to the public. They had taken all of their old prototypes, spruced them up, and then given them away to heroes in need. That had been the move that really got them scholarships to colleges and other programs for higher education. Little did she know that story had inspired a monster of a project. Within 2 days, Izuku and his sister had a whole, well-drawn-up folder worth of plans and projected numbers to give to their principal. And the rat, ever willing to support the creatives under his care, agreed. The fact that it would look good on UA as a whole as well was just a bonus. It only took a week for the project to be announced to the rest of the support students in all 3 years. Unexpectedly, though in retrospect he really shouldn't have been surprised. When the outreach project was announced to the news, Mei and Izuku's names were all over it. The 2 teens were asked to make statements for fluff pieces across Japan. Most of Mei's lines didn't get used, her over-the-top personality being too much for most people and resigning her to a few short usable clips. But the sweet stuttering hero student stole the watchers' hearts, and he soon found himself as the face of the project. And this was to be the first large-scale donation. There had been a few other small donations, a finished prototype here, a bit of support gear for a sidekick there. But this was the one that would be all over the news. The morning he was meant to give over the goods was the morning he told his dads anything. Having successfully kept his actual designs quiet, the men were surprised when Mia showed up on campus that morning, barging into the teacher's dorm and the breakfast the kids had come over to share with their dads and Eri. "You ready, kiddos?" Yamada and Shouta shared confused looks at her excitement and the mischief in the air. The feeling only thickened when their little greenette reached down to grab a box from his backpack. Scarred hands held it out to his blonde paternal figure with a sweet smile. "It only feels right if you're the first to get them. After all, you were my first customer." As Ashi blinked before taking the box, he opened it slowly, only to gasp and immediately pop his hearing aids out so he could slip the new ones in. The freckled boy laughed. "I have them configured to the same settings as the ones on record in your files, but you will probably have to make some adjustments on the sound. Sorry, run opening diagnostics." Mike jumped, probably surprised by a woman's voice responding in affirmative in his ears. Izuku went on, "We can rename her in your system so she won't get confused when I give my own version orders. I was going to, but I figured it would be better to give you a choice on the name you'll be yelling out in battles and stuff." He trailed off as he switched his own hearing aids out, finally able to wear his now that the surprise was over. He was just sliding the second one home when he was blindsided by a hug. Mike blubbering about how happy he was and how cool the lady sounded, all while firing off questions on what she could do. Izuku giggled and watched as Shouta snagged the instruction manual from the box to flip through while his husband calmed down. Later, in the gym set aside for the afternoon for the small event, the 3 parents and a whole slew of support and hero students would stand to the side and watch in pride. Izuku going around a large circle of firefighters, police officers, Ms, and heroes thanking them for their service and handing each of them a matching box. A line of tables nearby set up with the gear needed to make any adjustments. The boy happily giving others back the sense he'd had to regain for himself. Izuku giggled as Hitoshi and Denki wrestled, going after each other's hair as they all walked down the sidewalk. Mia had requested they all visit the shop after school that Friday, saying something about her workspace being too quiet for her to design anything new. So a small group of their friends were all showing up in the name of free food and a space to hang out without the pressure of school for an evening. Kuriyama was walking by the greenette, showing him pictures on his phone. The large support student had just finished his prototype design for a small-time sidekick's image overhaul. All he needed now was to do a final fitting and then he could make the real thing out of actual hero-grade fabric. Izuku gushed over the red and orange-clad mannequin, excited and raving over how clean the lines looked and how it really played off the sidekick's quirk. They chatted about the gear upgrades that were also being made for the rest of their way to the shop, occasionally pausing to laugh at the antics of the other teens around them. Eventually, they all trickled in through the back entrance, a riot of greetings from the other teens to the adult they all expected to be there, and the ones that most of them expected to be there. The only one not in the loop paused in confusion at the doorway, absolutely taken off guard at the unexpected guests. Mia stepped in quickly, rushing over to give her 2 kiddos a hug and drag them a few steps over in the name of unblocking the doorway. "Hi, Izuku. Sorry, I hope you don't mind that I invited them. I thought it would be nice to catch up. Your dads will be here soon too." Yeah, that's okay. Just surprised." With that, he offers the redhead a smile before wandering over to the Mirakumas to say hi. He had stopped going to his after-school classes slowly after his introduction into the hero course. He just had too much to do, and honestly, with the amount of physical exertion he dealt with during both hero and support lessons, he really did need the after-school breaks. And then the summer camp incident happened, and suddenly he had way too much to think about to remember to call and talk to his first martial arts teacher. His daughter stepped forwards to meet the younger teen first, scooping the greenette into a hug with a cheerful hello and an admonishment for having gotten into so much trouble recently. He giggled and hugged her back, signing an inside joke one-handed and making her laugh. Her father rolled his eyes at their antics before reaching forwards to rest a bear-like hand in tousled curls. "You had us worried for a bit there, kid. Glad you made it out all right." The small teen smiled up at him before shifting into a grin. "Yeah, well, I had this teacher who made sure I knew how to do a proper Osoto Gari. He was a real bear about it. Had us practice the throw for weeks." Both of the Kurokumas blinked in slight shock at the easy confidence behind the joke, before Kuma-chan howled in laughter, patting him on the shoulder, pointing at her dad's face and setting herself off even more. It took a minute, but eventually the man himself snorted and ruffled green hair roughly, shaking his own head before wandering off to chat with the other adult in the room. Soon caught her breath before pointing over to the teens who were standing off to the side, specifically the four who had been watching their exchange closely. "So, friends?" Izuku glanced over to see who she was pointing out and flushed when his gaze met Hitoshi's. "Not exactly. The girl is Mei. Her mom is adopting me. And other three, they're my boyfriends." Her squeal caught the attention of everyone in the room, though most of them figured out what was going on and went back to their own conversations fairly quickly, only sparing a chuckle or two at Izuku's embarrassment as the closest thing he had to a childhood friend dragged him over to his partners in a demand to be introduced. The Umezawa showed up a bit later with a backseat filled with takeout, enchiladas and tamales in large foil trays, and large styrofoam buckets of spiced rice and beans, both charo and refried. Izuku helped the other teens unload the bounty from the SUV and settle it in a spread on one cleared workbench. Everyone dug in with gusto, cheerfully fawning over the well-balanced verde sauce and the signs of salsa. The small greenette found himself settled on a stool beside the elder Mirokuma, giving the man an in-depth rundown of his recent combat training, explaining his decision to opt for a more sneaky style. The giant beside him hummed along as he munched down a chicken tamale, commenting occasionally and giving small tidbits of advice on training methods. The teen filed those away to run by Aizawa later, knowing the suggestions were worth a try. After about an hour, the food was mostly gone and a bit of weird anticipation seemed to seep into the room from between the shelves of parts. Izuku felt his stomach twist in discomfort, uncertain about what was happening, obviously out of the loop. At this point of the evening, most of their friends would have to be heading home. They should be packing their bags and comparing train schedules. Instead, they were all slowly turning their attention to the center of the room. The center of the room where he just so happened to be sitting. Before he had time to overthink, Mia stepped into his line of sight, and the large folder in her hands clued him in on what was happening. He launched himself from his stool and into her arms, happy tears already slipping down his cheeks. She chuckled as she hugged him close. "It's official, kiddo. You're now Hatsu Mizuku." There were cheers from all around them as Mei joined in their hug. Izuku did the best to commit the moment to memory, especially the feeling of being wrapped up in the warmth of his mom and sister. He wanted to be able to look back in this moment with the fondness it deserved after all. Green eyes twinkled as Mei paced frantically around her messy dorm room, Izuku laughing at his sister's antics as she half-panicked trying to find a shirt without some sort of grease stain. "Mei, come on. You act like the two of you haven't been hanging out after school nearly every day for the past 2 months. She knows exactly what you look like and she's okay with it. So take a deep breath and chill." He reached out and snagged her wrist as she went to walk back past him yet again, pulling her to a stop. Though stopping her physical pacing didn't stop the mental marathon. "Izu, I can't just go see her for a date looking like I always do. She deserves better than that. She's so pretty and fun and clean and pretty, and she should date someone who isn't some grungy freak." She was almost hyperventilating by the end of her rushed speech, and her brother quickly sobered as he caught on to the deeper stressor she had just let slip. "Is this about what the kids at your old school used to say? But you always said you didn't mind." Golden eyes dodged his concerned look, the young woman frowning and rubbing at her arm a bit. Izuku let her work through her thoughts patiently, knowing well how hard words could be at times. Eventually, he was rewarded with a dramatic groan and his sister flopping down on her back on her bed beside him. "I thought I didn't, but then she's so fashionable. And I'm Mei. What do I have to offer someone who's so her?" Izuku sighed. "Mei, I really don't think she cares about how you look. Whenever we hang out, all she can talk about is how fun you are, how smart you are. She really likes that about you, I think. And speaking from personal opinion, your best feature is how genuine you are to yourself. I'm sure she really likes that too. So just wear what makes you comfortable, yeah." His sister pouted, but seemed to let his words play back in her head a few times. Eventually, he huffed out a breath in irritation. Okay, but what if none of these clothes make me feel comfortable today? Izuku hummed in response before grinning, obviously struck with an idea. He hopped up from his seat and sifted through one of the piles of clothing that had been tossed around, coming up with her newest overalls and a pink tank top. Once he had what he wanted, he snagged the pinkette by the hand and led her out of the support dorms into 1AS building across the way. They went upstairs to his own dorm and he started sifting through his own closet, though in a more organized way than May had done just minutes before. After a moment, he handed his sister one of his red button-up shirts and a pair of his simple black tights. Okay, put all of this on and we will go from here. With that order, he slipped out into the hall to give her privacy, texting one of his boyfriends as he went. She looked a bit uncomfortable when she opened the door to let Izuku and the newly arrived Denki in. She had buttoned the shirt up all the way and had everything strictly the way it was intended to be worn. Both boys observed the outfit for a moment before Denki clicked his tongue decisively. Okay, you look good, but not like you. Let's fix that. He stepped forwards and with permission started in on buttons and straps, undoing the top 4 buttons of the shirt so it sat open loosely. He then unhooked one of the overall straps and slipped it around so it went under her arm before hooking it back into place. Then he rolled the sleeves up to her elbows. With that, he stepped back, giving her another once-over before nodding in approval. Much better. Now, sit at the desk. I brought some of my makeup and hair stuff, so let's have some fun. They tried several things, Denki having never styled locks before, and eventually settled on a simple metal beret holding her bangs back. And for makeup, they kept with the simple theme. Eyeliner, a bit of concealer over dark circles, and a tinted chapstick just a shade or two darker than her natural lips. By then, May's phone was chiming with an alarm to let her know it was time for her to go. The girl hopping up and giving both of the boys a hug and thanks before she shook the nerves out of her hands and made her way to meet up with Mina. Izuku grinned up at his blonde and gave Denki a quick peck of his own thanks, before asking if the other boy needed help with the essay he was putting off. A sheepish smile was all he needed in response. Now that all of his personal problems had been dealt with, Izuku realized that an issue they had pushed to the wayside really needed to be addressed. Endeavor. The man had reportedly chilled out a bit after Shadow started using his flames in combat, but he was still a demanding bastard. Shadow spent most of his weekends at his family home, slogging through extra training and coming back to the dorms last Sunday evenings exhausted and grumpy, not at all ready for the week of heavy classwork ahead. Endeavor was running his son into the ground, and Izuku wouldn't stand for it. Lucky for him, computers were his friends. All it took was a week of not really sleeping in the name of eking out every extra minute of computer time he could get. He hacked several government sites and several of Endeavor's own files, taking what he needed and compiling his evidence. It was 5 a.m. on the 8th day of hyper-focused plotting when he finally had everything ready to go. He hit the enter key, said a quick prayer, and then passed out on his desk. Aizawa was the one to come and find him a few hours later when he didn't show up for homeroom. He had noticed Izuku was distracted by something for a few days by that point and wasn't surprised to find the boy slumped over his computer. No, what made him raise an eyebrow was the report on the teen's screen. After reading a few lines, the pro sighed and texted his boss. Nezu texted back a gleeful reply that he had already received a copy, causing the tired hero to groan before accepting his fate and stowing his phone so he could pick up his kid and put him to bed. Later that day, the report would hit the news. By the end of the week, Shadow would be under the custody of his sister, his father under investigation for corruption and abuse. And by the next month, Todoroki Rei would be a free woman with a home of her own for her and her kids should they wish to join her. Shadow himself was quietly relieved, happy to be able to take breaks without someone breathing down his neck, happier still to have the weekends for himself, whether he wanted alone time or wanted to go on dates with his partners. It was his choice, and that was a luxury he would forever cherish. And so they settled in, getting used to their new lives, preparing for their futures full of creating and helping and saving, full of excitement and happiness, and yes, fear and sorrow. Because life is more worth living in the bright spots after you've dragged yourself through the dark spots. And now none of them would have to go through the dark spots alone again. Because the best family is the one you make for yourself.